The bitter wind howled across the barren plains, carrying dust and broken dreams in its wake. Margaret Winters pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the edge of Eagle Ridge settlement, her weathered face set like stone, despite the tears that threatened to fall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Behind her, the harsh voices of the town council still echoed. In her ears, words sharper than any knife. Useless, burden, one less mouth to feed. 67 years of life, of loving, of giving, and in the end, they had cast her out like yesterday's scraps when the food stores ran low. Take what you can carry, they had told her, not meeting her eyes. The winter is coming. We barely have enough for those who can contribute. Now, she stood at the crossroads, her few possessions bundled in a small cart, wondering which path led to a quicker death. The endless plains to the east or the Lakota territories to the west. Perhaps it didn't matter. The drought had taken her husband, her home, and now her community. What was left to lose? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Margaret made her choice. If death was coming, she would meet it on her own terms. She turned west toward the setting sun and began her final journey. Margaret Winters had once been the heartbeat of Eagle Ridge settlement. For 20 years, she had birthed the babies, tended the sick, and preserved the harvest alongside her husband, Joseph. She had weathered storms, both literal and figurative. The flood of '59 that nearly washed away the settlement, the influenza that took a third of their population, and the endless negotiations with neighboring tribes that kept an uneasy peace on the frontier. Through it all, she had endured, her spine straight and her hands steady. But the drought of 1878 had broken more than just the land. 3 years without proper rain had turned the once fertile valley into a wasteland of cracked earth and withered hopes. The crops failed, the cattle grew thin, and the people of Eagle Ridge turned inward, their generosity shriveling like the corn in their fields. Joseph had been the first casualty in their household, his heart giving out as he struggled to plow the unyielding soil in the relentless heat. At 67, Margaret found herself alone in a community that no longer had room for those who couldn't work from sunup to sundown. "We're making hard decisions for the good of all," Robert Blackwood, the head of the town council, had explained earlier that day, his voice strained with what might have been regret, but could just as easily have been impatience. "Every person must contribute or they must leave," finished William Fletcher, another council member whose family had arrived at the settlement the same year as Margaret and Joseph. Once, their children had played together. Now, he looked at her as if she were a stranger. "I've contributed my entire life," Margaret had protested, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've delivered your children, William. I've nursed your wife through childbed fever. That was then," Robert cut in. "We're talking about now, about the winter coming, about mouths to feed and bodies to warm. Your skills were valuable once, but I've grown old," Margaret finished for him, her voice hollow, "and you've decided I'm expendable." The silence that followed was answer enough. Now, as Margaret trudged along the western trail, her cart creaking behind her, she wondered how long it would take. Would she reach the Lakota territories before her strength gave out? Would they kill her quickly, or would she simply collapse somewhere along the way, becoming food for the coyotes and buzzards? There was a certain poetry to it, returning to the earth, feeding the cycle of life when the humans she had nurtured had decided she was no longer worth sustaining. The first night came quickly, darkness falling over the plains like a shroud. Margaret made a small fire with the precious few sticks she had gathered along the way, her fingers stiff with cold and age. She had food for perhaps 3 days, a small sack of cornmeal, some dried beans, and a strip of jerky that she had been saving for a special occasion. How absurd that seemed now. Sleep came in fits and starts, her dreams haunted by the faces of those she had left behind, or rather those who had left her behind. Sarah Moon, whose breech baby Margaret had turned, saving both mother and child. Mary Henderson, whose fever Margaret had broken with poultices and prayers when the doctor had given up hope. Children she had watched grow, elderly she had eased. Into death with dignity, a lifetime of care erased by a single season of hardship. Dawn broke grey and threatening, the clouds hanging low with the promise of snow. Margaret packed her meagre camp and continued westward, each step a small defiance against the fate that had been thrust upon her. By midday, the first flakes began to fall, delicate and deadly in their beauty. "At least it's not dust," Margaret murmured to herself, her voice rough from disuse and cold. The humor was bitter but somehow necessary, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of observing the world around her. If these were to be her last days, she would live them fully aware. The snow intensified as the afternoon wore on, the flakes becoming thicker, more insistent. Margaret's pace slowed, her breathing labored as she pushed through drifts that reached her knees. The cart became heavier, harder to pull, until at last she was forced to abandon it, taking only what she could carry in a small pack. Night was approaching again, and with it the deadly cold that had claimed so many unprepared travelers. Margaret knew she needed shelter, but the landscape offered little. A few scattered trees, their branches bare and clawing at the sky, and occasional rocky outcroppings that provided minimal protection from the wind. It was near one such outcropping that she found it, a small cave, barely more than a depression in the rock face, but deep enough to shield her from the worst of the elements. With the last of her strength, Margaret gathered what brush she could, found and created a barrier across the entrance, then huddled against the back wall, wrapping her shawl around her like armor. "Not yet," she whispered into the gathering darkness. "Not like this." The night brought a peculiar clarity, the kind that comes only when the body has been pushed beyond its limits. Margaret found herself thinking not of her expulsion from Eagle Ridge, but of her life before. The children she and Joseph had lost in infancy, the garden she had tended with religious devotion, the quilting circle where news and gossip flowed as freely as the cider they shared. Simple joys, ordinary sorrows, the texture of a life well lived despite its hardships. As consciousness began to slip away, Margaret was almost grateful. It was a gentler death than many she had witnessed. No pain, just a gradual surrender to the cold that had become almost comforting in its persistence. It was the sound that roused her first, a rhythmic crunching of snow beneath heavy footfalls. Then the light, golden and flickering against her closed eyelids. Finally the voice, deep and resonant, speaking words in a language she didn't understand, but in a tone that demanded response. Margaret forced her eyes open, blinking against the sudden brightness. A figure stood at the entrance to her small shelter, holding a torch aloft. Behind him, she could make out other shapes, other torches, a search party of some kind. But they were not the settlers from Eagle Ridge. These men wore fur and leather, their long hair adorned with feathers and beads, their faces painted with marks she recognized from her limited interactions with the local tribes. "Lakota," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The man with the torch stepped forward, crouching to study her with dark, intelligent eyes. He was perhaps 50, his face lined with experience rather than age, his bearing that of someone accustomed to authority. He spoke again, this time in accented but understandable English. "You are far from your people, grandmother." Grandmother. The word struck Margaret with unexpected force, not useless, not burden. Grandmother, a term of respect among the native peoples she knew. "I have no people," she managed to reply, her throat painfully dry. "Not anymore." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. He turned, speaking rapidly to the others in their native tongue. There was a brief discussion, voices rising and falling like the wind outside, before he turned. Back to Margaret. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I am Thomas Running Wolf," he said, his voice carrying the weight of formal introduction. "Chief of the Pine Creek Band, you will come with us." It wasn't a question or even a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of one who expected to be obeyed. Under normal circumstances, Margaret might have bristled at the presumption. Now, with death a whispered promise in the howling wind, she could only nod. Gentle hands lifted her, wrapping her in furs that smelled of smoke and pine. She was placed on a travois, secured against the jarring journey ahead. As consciousness slipped away once more, Margaret had a single clear thought. Whatever waited at the end of this journey, be it death or something altogether unexpected, it would not be the lonely end she had resigned herself to mere hours before. The Lakota had found her. For better or worse, her fate was now in their hands. Margaret awoke to warmth and the gentle crackling of a fire. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind. Was she back in her cabin in Eagle Ridge? Had the expulsion been nothing more than a fever dream? But the smell was wrong. Not the familiar scent of her own hearth, but something richer, earthier, tinged with herbs she couldn't identify. Slowly, she opened her eyes. She lay in a lodge of some kind, its walls made of hide stretched over a wooden frame. A fire burned in a central pit, smoke rising to escape through an opening at the top. Furs and woven blankets were piled around her, creating a nest of unexpected comfort. Across the fire sat a young man, perhaps 20, his attention focused on something in his hands, a piece of wood he was carefully carving with a small knife. Margaret shifted, and the young man looked up, his dark eyes widening slightly at finding her awake. He said something in Lakota, then, seeming to remember, himself switched to English. "You are awake. Good. My father will want to know." He set aside his carving and rose in a fluid motion. "I will bring him." Before Margaret could respond, he had slipped out through the lodge entrance, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the dancing flames. She took stock of her situation. Her clothes had been changed, she realized with a jolt of surprise. She now wore a soft buckskin dress, its surface adorned with subtle beadwork. Her hands, once nearly frozen, were warm and supple, her fingers moving without the pain that had become a constant companion. The lodge entrance opened again, admitting Thomas Running Wolf, the man from the night before. In the firelight, Margaret could see him more clearly, the streaks of gray in his long hair, the lines of authority etched into his face, the quiet dignity in his bearing. "You are stronger than you look," he said without preamble, settling across the fire from her. "Many would not have survived such a night." Margaret pushed herself to a sitting position, wincing slightly at the stiffness in her joints. "I'm not sure whether to thank you for that observation or be offended by it." To her surprise, Thomas laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. "The white woman has spirit. Good, you will need it." "For what?" Margaret asked, wariness creeping into her voice. She had heard stories of what happened to settlers captured by native tribes, stories she had always suspected were exaggerated by those with an interest in painting the indigenous peoples as savages, but stories nonetheless. Thomas studied her for a long moment before responding. "For living," he said simply. "Why were you alone in the snow, grandmother? Where is your family?" The word grandmother again. Not a reference to actual relation, Margaret knew, but a term of respect. Coming from this man, it felt genuine in a way that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Dead or gone," she answered honestly. "My husband passed 3 seasons ago. We had no children who survived infancy. And my community..." The word tasted bitter on her tongue. "They decided I was no longer useful, that I consumed resources I could not replace." Thomas's expression darkened. "They cast you out in winter?" Margaret nodded, a strange sense of shame washing over her despite knowing she had done nothing to deserve such treatment. "Food is scarce. The drought has been hard on everyone. They made a calculation. A poor one," Thomas said firmly. "The wisdom of elders is not measured in the strength of their backs or the food they can gather. It is here," he tapped his temple, "and here," he placed a hand over his heart. "Your people have forgotten this." "They are not my people anymore," Margaret said, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. Thomas nodded once, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Rest now. When you are stronger, we will talk more." The young man who had been in the lodge, when she awoke, returned, carrying a wooden bowl filled with some kind of stew. The rich aroma made Margaret's stomach clench with sudden hunger. "My son Daniel," Thomas introduced. "He found your trail in the snow. Without him, we would not have reached you in time." Daniel set the bowl beside Margaret, his movements careful and deliberate. "You should eat," he said, his English more heavily accented than his father's, but still clear. "The medicine woman says you need strength." Margaret accepted the bowl with murmured thanks, surprised by how difficult it was to maintain composure in the face of such unexpected kindness. The stew was gamey, but good, rich with unfamiliar roots and herbs that warmed her from the inside out. She ate slowly, conscious of being watched but too hungry to be bothered by the scrutiny. When she had finished, Daniel took the bowl and left the lodge once more. Thomas remained, his dark eyes thoughtful as he added wood to the fire. "Why? Did you help me?" Margaret asked finally, the question that had been gnawing at her since she awakened. "Your people and mine are not friends." Thomas looked up, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Is that what you believe, that we are enemies?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," Margaret admitted. "I thought I knew my place in the world, among people I had lived with for decades. I was wrong about that." "Perhaps you were wrong about other things as well," Thomas suggested, his tone neutral. Before Margaret could respond, the lodge entrance opened again, admitting an elderly woman whose face was as lined and weathered as Margaret's own. She moved with a deliberate grace, her back straight despite her advanced years, her grey hair braided and wrapped in strips of red cloth. She carried a small pouch from which she withdrew various items: a bundle of dried herbs, a small stone bowl, a leather flask. "This is Wichapi," Thomas said, "our medicine woman. She tended to you while you slept." Wichapi nodded to Margaret, speaking in Lakota. Thomas translated, "She says your spirit is strong, but your body is tired. She has medicine that will help." Margaret watched as Wichapi ground herbs in the stone bowl, adding water from the flask, to create a paste that she then applied to Margaret's temples and wrists. The scent was sharp and clean, reminiscent of mint, but with an underlying earthiness that Margaret couldn't identify. "Thank you," Margaret said directly to Wichapi, who looked up with eyes that seemed to see more than just the physical form before her. Wichapi spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "She says you are welcome among us," Thomas translated. "The winter is hard, but we face it together. No one walks alone into the snow." The simple statement held such profound contrast to what Margaret had experienced at Eagle Ridge that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to show such vulnerability before these strangers who had already seen her at her weakest. "Why?" she asked again, needing to understand. "Why would you welcome an old white woman who brings nothing of value?" Thomas looked to Wichapi, who was repacking her medicinal supplies. The older woman spoke at length, her hands moving in expressive gestures that seemed as much a part of her communication as the words themselves. "She says that value is not measured in youth or strength alone," Thomas translated, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of Wichapi's speech. "A tree that has weathered many seasons may not bear as much fruit, but its roots run deep, anchoring all that grow in its shadow. Its branches may not reach as high, but they provide shelter to those who seek rest. The wisdom in its rings cannot be replaced by saplings, no matter how vigorous their growth." Margaret felt something shift within her, a loosening of the despair that had taken root when the council announced their decision. It wasn't hope, not yet, but perhaps the soil in which hope might eventually grow. Wichapi finished speaking and rose, placing a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder before leaving the lodge. Thomas remained, his expression thoughtful. "Rest now," he said again. "Tomorrow, when you are stronger, you will join us for the council fire. There is much to discuss." Left alone, Margaret settled back into the furs, her mind whirling with questions and uncertainties. She had expected death on the plains, or, at best, a quick end at the hands of those she had been taught to fear. Instead, she had found something entirely unexpected: respect, care, and the suggestion that she might still have value beyond what her aging body could physically contribute. As sleep claimed her once more, Margaret wondered what the council fire would bring. Whatever awaited her among the Lakota, it seemed it would not be the lonely end she had resigned herself to. For now, that was enough. The following days brought a gradual integration into the rhythms of Lakota life that both bewildered and fascinated Margaret. Her strength returned slowly, nurtured by Wichapi's herbal medicines and the surprisingly nutritious food that appeared regularly. Stews rich, with game meat and wild tubers, flatbread made from ground seeds, and teas brewed from roots and berries that seemed to chase the lingering chill from her bones. Daniel, Thomas's son, became an unexpected companion during her recovery. He would sit with her in the afternoons, whittling or mending tools while she gained strength, occasionally asking questions about the settler world with a curiosity that betrayed his youth. "Is it true that white people sleep in boxes?" he asked one day, his hands busy with a piece of antler he was fashioning into a needle. Margaret smiled despite herself. "We call them beds, but yes, I suppose they do look like boxes to someone, used to sleeping on furs. And you live in square lodges that cannot be moved when the seasons change." "Houses," Margaret corrected gently. "Yes, they stay in one place. They don't follow the seasons or the herds." Daniel shook his head, clearly perplexed by such an impractical arrangement. "And what do you do when the game moves away or the water dries up?" The question struck Margaret with unexpected force, reminding her of Eagle Ridge's inability to adapt to the drought. "They suffer," she said simply, "or they drive away those they think they can't feed." Daniel looked up, his dark eyes serious. "Like they did to you." It wasn't a question, and Margaret didn't treat it as one. "Yes. The council would never allow such a thing here," Daniel said with the certainty of youth. "Especially not to an elder. It would bring great shame." Before Margaret could respond, the lodge entrance opened, admitting Thomas. He nodded to his son, who quickly gathered his tools and slipped out, leaving them alone. "You are stronger today," Thomas observed, settling across from her. Margaret nodded. "Your medicine woman knows her craft, and the food has been—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. Sustaining. Thomas's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. High praise from a white woman. Many of your kind find our ways strange. I'm finding many things strange these days, Margaret admitted, including the kindness of those I was taught to fear. Thomas studied her for a long moment. Fear is a poor teacher, he said finally. It blinds us to truth. And what is the truth? Margaret asked, genuinely curious about how this man viewed the complex relations between their peoples. That we are all trying to survive on the same land, Thomas replied simply. Some with respect, others with greed. But the land remembers, and it teaches hard lessons to those who take without giving back. It was a philosophy Margaret had seldom heard expressed so directly, though she recognized the wisdom in it. Joseph had held similar views, often arguing with neighbors about farming practices that depleted the soil instead of nurturing it. The council fire is tonight, Thomas continued, changing the subject. You will attend. Again, not a request, but a statement of fact. Margaret had learned enough about Lakota customs by now to understand that this was a significant event, one normally reserved for tribal members. Why? She asked, echoing the question that had become something of a refrain between them. Why would you include me in your council? Thomas's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a spark of something, amusement perhaps, or approval at her directness. Because you have knowledge we need, he said simply, and because the spirits have brought you to us for a purpose. Margaret wasn't sure how to respond to the latter part of his statement. The Lakota's spiritual beliefs were still largely mysterious to her, but the former caught her attention. What knowledge could I possibly have that would be of use to you and your people? Thomas rose, moving toward the lodge entrance. You lived through many winters. You know how the white settlers preserve food, treat illness, survive when crops fail. The drought affects us all, grandmother. Our hunters find less game, our gatherers fewer plants. We face the same hunger that drove your people to cast you out. With that sobering statement, he left, leaving Margaret to contemplate his words. The idea that the Lakota were struggling with the same food shortages as Eagle Ridge had never occurred to her. In her limited interactions with native peoples over the years, they had always seemed self-sufficient, perfectly adapted to the harsh realities of life on the plains. But of course, they would suffer from the same drought, the same scarcity of game. The difference, it seemed, was not in their circumstances, but in how they responded to them. Not by discarding their vulnerable members, but by seeking knowledge that might help them all survive. As evening approached, Wichapi arrived to help. Margaret prepared for the council. She brought a clean dress, similar to the one Margaret had been wearing, but more elaborately decorated with beadwork and quills. She helped Margaret braid her silver hair, weaving strips of red cloth similar to her own through the plaits. Throughout the process, she spoke in her native tongue, seemingly unconcerned that Margaret couldn't understand. There was something comforting about her presence nonetheless, the sure movements of her gnarled hands, the quiet dignity in her bearing, the occasional smiles that transformed her weathered face into a map of lived experience rather than simply old age. When they were finished, Wichapi stepped back to examine her work, nodding in apparent satisfaction. She gestured for Margaret to follow her outside. The evening air was crisp but not bitter, the sky clear and star-strewn overhead. In the center of the encampment, a large fire blazed, surrounded by members of the tribe seated in a rough circle. Thomas sat near the fire, distinguished by a headdress of eagle feathers that he had not worn in previous encounters. Daniel sat. To his right, his posture formal and attentive. As Margaret approached, guided by Wichapi, a hush fell over the gathering. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, evaluating, curious, some perhaps hostile. Thomas rose, speaking in Lakota. then switched to English, presumably for her benefit. "We welcome Margaret Winters to our council fire," he announced. "She comes to us as a stranger, but sits with us as a guest. The spirits guided her to our lands for a purpose. Tonight, we will discover what that purpose may be." He gestured for Margaret to sit in a place that had been left open near the fire across from him. Whichapi settled beside her, a reassuring presence in the face of so much scrutiny. "The drought has brought hardship to our people," Thomas continued, addressing the council. "Game is scarce. The plants our mothers and grandmothers gathered to sustain us through winter are few. The settlers feel the same bite of hunger, and their response was to cast out this elder, believing one less mouth to feed would help them survive." Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the gathering. Margaret felt a flush of shame, not for herself, but for the community that had so easily discarded her. "But there is wisdom in experience," Thomas went on. "Margaret has lived through many seasons of plenty and want. She knows the ways of her people, how they preserve food, how they treat illness, how they survive when nature turns against them. I have asked her to share this knowledge with us, that we might all survive until the rains return." He turned to Margaret, his expression solemn. "Will you speak, grandmother? Will you share what you know with those who would listen?" Put on the spot, Margaret felt a moment of panic. What could she possibly offer these people who had survived on these lands for generations before her kind had ever set foot here? But as she looked around the circle, she saw something unexpected in many faces. Not disdain or skepticism, but genuine interest. A willingness to listen that she had not experienced in her final days at Eagle Ridge. "I am not sure what knowledge I have that would be useful to you," she began hesitantly, "but what I know, I will share." And so she began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. She told them of the methods she had developed over decades of frontier life, how to preserve meat with less salt by smoking it in specific ways, how to identify plants that remained viable even in drought conditions, how to extract nutrition from parts of animals the settlers typically discarded. She spoke of the remedies she had concocted when the settlement's doctor was unavailable. Tinctures and poultices made from plants that grew on the boundaries between forest and plain. Treatments for fever and infection that combined traditional settler knowledge with adaptations she had developed through trial and error. As she spoke, she noticed Whichapi nodding occasionally, sometimes murmuring translations to those nearby when Margaret mentioned a plant or technique that seemed to pique particular interest. Others in the circle leaned forward, their expressions intent and thoughtful. When she finally fell silent, uncertain whether she had offered anything of real value, Thomas spoke again. "You see," he addressed the council, "the Great Spirit sends us what we need, if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. Margaret's knowledge combined with our own ways may help us endure until the rains return." An older man across the circle spoke up, his voice rough with age, but carrying the weight of authority. Thomas translated for Margaret's benefit. "Black Elk asks if you would be willing to work with our medicine women to show them these methods you speak of, to teach as well." Astel. The request took Margaret by surprise. It was one thing to share knowledge in the abstract, quite another to be invited to actively participate in the tribe's survival strategies. Yet, wasn't this exactly what had been denied her at Eagle Ridge? The opportunity to contribute in ways that went beyond physical labor. "I would be honored," she replied sincerely, "though I have much to learn of your ways as well." This response seemed to satisfy Black Elk, who nodded and settled back. Others spoke up, asking questions through Thomas about specific techniques Margaret had mentioned. The discussion continued well into the night, the practical concerns of survival slowly giving way to stories and reminiscences as the fire burned lower. Margaret found herself listening as much as speaking, absorbed by tales of Lakota history and mythology. that Thomas or Daniel occasionally translated for her benefit. There was wisdom in these stories, she realized, practical knowledge wrapped in narrative, preserved and passed down through generations. It was a different kind of wisdom than the pragmatic problem-solving she had practiced throughout her life, but no less valuable for its differences. In fact, the integration of practical knowledge with spiritual understanding seemed to offer a more complete approach to survival than either tradition alone. As the council fire finally burned down to embers and the gathering dispersed, Thomas approached Margaret, who was fighting exhaustion despite the exhilaration of the evening. "You spoke well," he said simply. "Tomorrow you will begin working with Wichapi and the other medicine women. There is much to do before the worst of winter comes." Margaret nodded, too tired for words, but filled with a sense of purpose she had thought forever lost to her. As Daniel helped her back to the lodge that had become her temporary home, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. Cast out by those who should have valued her most, only to find unexpected respect among those she had been taught to fear. There was a lesson in that, she thought, as sleep claimed her. Perhaps several lessons if she had the wisdom to recognize them. The integration of Margaret's knowledge with Lakota practices proceeded more smoothly than anyone might have expected. Each morning, she joined Wichapi and several other women in gathering what plants could still be found beneath the snow or preserved from earlier harvests. They worked together, preparing remedies and preserving what food was available. Communication, bridged by gestures, demonstration, and Thomas or Daniel's occasional translations. Margaret found herself learning as much as she taught, discovering plants she had never used before, techniques for preservation that were more efficient than her own, and remedies that worked differently but often more effectively than those she had developed over the years. But there was resistance as well, primarily from a council elder named Robert Blackwood. His Lakota name translated roughly to Black Wood in English, but he preferred the anglicized version. Having spent time among white traders in his youth, he watched Margaret's growing integration into tribal life with obvious displeasure, his objections becoming more vocal as the days passed. "She brings the white man's ways to our people," he argued during one council meeting, speaking in English, deliberately so Margaret could understand his opposition. "Soon we will forget our own traditions, become dependent on settler knowledge," Thomas responded with measured patience. "Knowledge is not owned by one people alone, Robert. We take what is useful, leave what is not, as we have always done." "And what does she take from us in return?" Robert demanded. "What secrets of our survival does she learn to carry back to her people when the snows melt?" The accusation stung Margaret, who had come to think of herself as someone with no people to return to. Before Thomas could reply, she spoke up. "I have no intention of returning to Eagle Ridge," she said firmly. "They cast me out. They are no longer my people." Robert's gaze was cold. "All white settlers are the same beneath their skin. They take and take, giving nothing back to the land or its original caretakers." "Enough, Robert," Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "Margaret has earned her place at our fire. The council has spoken." The confrontation subsided, but Margaret could feel Robert's antagonism like a physical presence whenever he was nearby. He was not alone in his skepticism, though others were less vocal about their concerns. She noticed certain tribal members keeping their distance, watching her interactions with Wichapi and the other medicine women with guarded expressions. Daniel, who had appointed himself as something of a cultural interpreter for Margaret, explained the underlying tension one afternoon as they worked together preparing a frame for drying meat. "Robert and his supporters believe mixing our ways with yours weakens us," he said, carefully shaping a wooden peg. "They fear that if we adopt any settler knowledge, we begin walking a path that ends with the loss of our identity." Margaret considered this as she wound sinew around the frame corners to strengthen them. "Is that what your father believes as well?" Daniel shook his head. "My father sees strength in adaptation. He says the tree that cannot bend in the wind will break. But Robert thinks bending is the first step toward breaking entirely," Margaret surmised. "Yes." Daniel glanced toward the edge of the encampment where Robert sat with several other men, their conversation too distant to overhear, but their gestures animated. "And there are others who listen to him." The conversation left Margaret unsettled. She had found purpose among the Lakota, a way to contribute that utilized her lifetime of experience rather than dismissing it as worthless. The thought that her presence might be creating division within the tribe troubled her deeply. That evening, she sought out Thomas, finding him alone near the river that marked the eastern boundary of the encampment. "Perhaps I should leave when the weather allows," she suggested without preamble. "Find another settlement, one that isn't Eagle Ridge." Thomas didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the frozen river. "Is that what you want?" "No," Margaret admitted, "but I don't want to be the cause of conflict among your people. Robert has always feared change," Thomas interrupted. "Even necessary change. It is his nature." "But he's not entirely wrong, is he?" Margaret pressed. "My presence, here the mixing of our knowledge, it does change things." Thomas turned to her then, his expression thoughtful. "All things change, grandmother. The river, the plains, the people who live on them. Those who cannot adapt do not survive. This is the law of nature." "And you believe the adaptation goes both ways? That your people can take what is useful from mine without losing what makes them Lakota?" "I do." Thomas's certainty was unwavering. "We have encountered many peoples over generations, other tribes, French trappers, Spanish explorers. From each, we have taken what strengthens us while keeping our core intact. Why should it be different with you?" Before Margaret could respond, a shout from the direction of the encampment drew their attention. Daniel was running toward them, his expression urgent. "Father, riders approaching from the east, settlers from Eagle Ridge." Thomas moved with surprising speed for a man of his years, striding toward the encampment with Margaret and Daniel following close behind. The news of settlers approaching had spread quickly, and the tribe was already preparing. Women gathering children, men retrieving weapons, elders moving toward the central lodges where they would be better protected. "How many?" Thomas asked as they walked. 6 riders, Daniel replied. "William Fletcher leads them." Margaret felt her heart constrict at the name. William, a man who had once called her friend, whose children she had delivered and tended through childhood illnesses. The same William who had sat silently as the council banished her to certain death. "What could they want?" she murmured, more to herself than her companions. Thomas glanced at her, his expression grim. "We will soon find out." By the time they reached the center of the encampment, the riders had arrived at its edge, halting their horses at the perimeter where several Lakota warriors stood in watchful readiness. Thomas stepped forward, his posture straight and dignified. Every inch the chief, despite the absence of his ceremonial headdress. "Stay behind me," he instructed Margaret quietly, "until we know their purpose." She nodded, suddenly uncertain of her place in this confrontation between the two worlds she had inhabited. The settlers dismounted but remained near their horses, clearly wary of the reception they might receive. William Fletcher stood slightly ahead of the others, his face haggard and drawn, his normally neat appearance disheveled. "Chief Running Wolf," he called, his voice carrying across the open space between them. "We come in peace, seeking help." Thomas made no immediate response, studying the group with deliberate calm. Margaret, partially concealed behind him, could see the other men who had accompanied William. The blacksmith, two farmers she recognized from neighboring properties, the young doctor who had replaced the one she had often assisted, and Robert Blackwood's son, James, who looked so much like his father that the resemblance was unsettling. "You come armed to our camp," Thomas observed finally, "and speak of peace." William glanced at the rifles secured to their saddles and had the grace to look abashed. "A precaution for the journey only. We mean no harm." "What help do you seek? From people you have long regarded as enemies?" Thomas asked, his tone neutral, but carrying an undertone of skepticism that Margaret found entirely justified. William's shoulders slumped slightly. "Sickness has come to Eagle Ridge, a fever that burns through our people like wildfire. Our doctor," he gestured to the young man beside him, "has tried everything he knows, but more fall ill each day. And you believe we can help?" Thomas's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. "We've heard that your medicine is powerful," William admitted, "that your healers know ways to fight fever that our doctors do not." Throughout this exchange, Margaret remained silent, processing what she was hearing. Eagle Ridge, the community that had cast her out to die, now sought help from those they had long disparaged and feared. The irony was almost too much to bear. "What medicine do you bring to trade?" Thomas asked, his question practical and direct. "What do you offer in exchange for our knowledge?" William exchanged glances with his companions, a silent communication that spoke volumes to Margaret, who knew these men well. They had come with empty hands, expecting what? That the Lakota would simply share their healing practices out of the goodness of their hearts? "We had hoped," William began hesitantly. "Given the circumstances, given that your people are dying," Thomas finished for him, his voice hardening, "you thought we would give freely what you have never valued before." The tension in the air thickened. Margaret could see the settlers' expressions shifting from hopeful to defensive, a transition she had witnessed countless times in negotiations between the communities. This would not end well if someone didn't intervene. Without fully considering the consequences, Margaret stepped forward, moving to stand beside Thomas rather than behind him. "Margaret?" William's shock was evident, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance, healthy, well-dressed in Lakota garments, clearly not the frozen corpse he might have expected. "You're alive. No thanks to you, William," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions churning within her. "Or to any in Eagle Ridge who stood by while I was sent to die." The other settlers stared, their expressions a mixture of shock, shame, and in the case of James Blackwood, something that looked like anger. "What is this?" James demanded, his voice sharp. "Have you turned traitor to your own kind, living among savages?" Margaret felt Thomas stiffen beside her, though his expression remained impassive. She placed a restraining hand on his arm, a gesture of familiarity that would not have been possible weeks earlier, but now felt natural. "The only savagery I've witnessed," she said clearly, "was when people I had lived alongside for 20 years decided an old woman's life was worth less than a few extra mouthfuls of food." Her words hung in the air, unanswerable in their truth. William had the decency to look away, unable to meet her gaze. "We didn't think you'd survive the journey," the young doctor offered, as if this somehow mitigated what had been done. "That was rather the point, wasn't it?" Margaret replied coldly. "A death that wouldn't bloody your hands directly." Thomas spoke then, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with presence. "You have not answered my question, William Fletcher. What do you bring to trade?" William's expression was pained. "We have little left, Chief Running Wolf. The drought took our crops. The fever takes our people. We come with empty hands but full hearts, asking for mercy." "Empty hands," Thomas repeated, his tone making it clear how little he thought of this approach. "Yet you expect to leave with full ones." The stalemate stretched, neither side willing to give ground, Margaret found herself torn, her anger at Eagle Ridge's betrayal still fresh, yet she could not bring herself to wish suffering on the innocent members of the community who had taken no part in the decision to cast her out. "There is another way," she said finally, looking to Thomas. "Let me go with them." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, the first time she had seen him genuinely surprised. "You would return to those who betrayed you." "Not to stay," Margaret clarified quickly. "But I've been learning from Wichapi. I know some of the remedies now, the herbs that might help with fever. I could go, treat their sick and return." "Margaret, no!" Daniel protested from behind them. "They don't deserve your help." She turned to the young man, touched by his concern. "Perhaps not," she agreed. "But there are children in Eagle Ridge, Daniel, elders who had no voice in the council's decision. They don't deserve to suffer either." Thomas studied her face, seeming to search for something beyond her words. Whatever he sought, he appeared to find it, for he nodded slowly. "You have a generous spirit, grandmother," he said quietly. "But the decision is not mine alone. The council must speak on this matter." He turned back to the settlers. "You will wait here," he instructed. "We will discuss your request and give answer before nightfall." William nodded, clearly relieved that they weren't being sent away immediately. "Thank you, Chief." Thomas led Margaret back toward the center of the encampment, where the council elders were already gathering, drawn by the news of the settlers' arrival. Robert Blackwood stood among them, his expression thunderous as he took in Margaret walking freely at Thomas's side. "You would consider helping them?" he demanded as they approached. "After what they did to her?" He jerked his chin toward Margaret, his apparent concern for her welfare incongruous with his previous antagonism. "I would consider what is best for all peoples who share these lands," Thomas replied evenly. "Come, the council will speak." The discussion that followed was heated, with Robert leading the faction opposed to any assistance being offered to Eagle Ridge. He argued forcefully that the settlers had brought their troubles upon themselves, through poor stewardship of the land and disrespect for those who had lived on it for generations. "Let them suffer as they have made others suffer," he urged, his eyes flashing with the fervor of long-held grievances. "Let them learn through pain what they would not learn through wisdom." Others, including Wichapi, advocated for a more measured approach, suggesting that helping the settlers through their crisis might lay groundwork for better relations in the future. Margaret, seated at the edge of the circle, listened intently as the debate flowed around her, most of it in Lakota, but with enough translated by Daniel for her to follow the general thrust. Finally, Thomas raised his hand, bringing the discussion to a close. He spoke at length in Lakota, his voice resonant with conviction. When he finished, he turned to Margaret. "The council has decided," he said. "We will help the people of Eagle Ridge, but not freely. They must understand the value of what they receive." "What is your price?" Margaret asked, uncertain what the settlers could offer that would satisfy both sides. Thomas's eyes held a glint that might have been satisfaction. "Knowledge, respect, and acknowledgement. William Fletcher and his companions will remain here while you, accompanied by Daniel and Wichapi, go to Eagle Ridge. You will teach their doctor our methods for treating fever, and he will teach Wichapi what he knows in return. And when spring comes, Eagle Ridge will send representatives to our council fire to discuss how we might live as neighbors rather than enemies." It was a bold proposal, not demanding immediate material compensation, which the settlers couldn't provide, but instead laying groundwork for a more profound shift in relations. Margaret wasn't sure William and the others would agree, given the deep-seated prejudices that ran through settler communities. "And if they refuse," she asked, "then they leave empty-handed?" Thomas replied simply, "The choice is theirs." The terms were presented to William and his companions, who received them with visible surprise. They had clearly expected demands for food, weapons or other tangible goods, the usual currency of negotiation between the communities. This request for exchange of knowledge and formal recognition was unprecedented. James Blackwood was the first to object. "We can't leave men behind as hostages," he protested, "and sending our representatives to their council in spring. The town would never—" "They are not hostages," Thomas interrupted firmly. "They are guests who will learn as well as teach. As for the Spring Council, if Eagle Ridge cannot bring itself to sit in peace with its neighbors after receiving their help, then perhaps it deserves whatever fate awaits it." William silenced James with a gesture, his expression thoughtful. "These terms are unexpected," he admitted, "but not unreasonable. I cannot speak for all of Eagle Ridge, but I believe the council will accept them, given the circumstances." And so it was decided. William and 2 others would remain in the Lakota camp, while James and another rider returned to Eagle Ridge to inform the council of the arrangement. Margaret, Wichapi, and Daniel would leave the following morning, bringing medicines and knowledge to combat the fever that threatened to devastate the settlement. That night, as preparations were made for the journey, Margaret sat by the fire in Thomas's lodge, her thoughts in turmoil. She had never expected to set foot in Eagle Ridge again, let alone to return as a healer, bringing salvation from an unexpected quarter. The irony was not lost on her nor on Thomas, who joined her after concluding his discussions with the council. "You are troubled," he observed, settling across from her. "I'm uncertain," Margaret corrected, "about returning to a place that rejected me so thoroughly." Thomas nodded, accepting the distinction. "It is a difficult path you walk, neither fully of your former people nor of ours, yet connected to both. Do you think this will change anything?" Margaret asked, gesturing vaguely to encompass the entire situation. "Or are we simply delaying the inevitable conflict between our peoples?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "I believe in the power of small changes," he said finally. "A stone dropped in still water creates ripples that reach far beyond its size. Your presence here has already changed us. Your return to Eagle Ridge may change them. Or they may take what we offer and return to their old ways as soon as the crisis passes," Margaret countered, giving voice to her deepest fear. "Humans have short memories when it comes to gratitude." "Some do," Thomas acknowledged, "but not all. And it is for those who remember that we make this effort." His conviction was a balm to Margaret's uncertainty. Whatever awaited her in Eagle Ridge, she would not face it alone. She had found something among the Lakota that she had lost long before her formal expulsion from settler society, a sense of purpose, of value that transcended mere utility. Dawn broke cold and clear, the sun casting long shadows across the frozen landscape as Margaret, Wichapi, and Daniel prepared for departure. William and the men who had remained behind watched the proceedings with barely concealed anxiety. Still, uncomfortable in their role as guests rather than negotiators, Thomas approached as they were about to leave, carrying a small bundle wrapped in soft hide. "For you," he said, handing it to Margaret. "A reminder of your place here, when the voices in Eagle Ridge would make you doubt." Margaret unwrapped the bundle to find an intricately beaded necklace, its design similar to those worn by tribal elders during ceremonial occasions. The gesture brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing that any more elaborate expression would be unnecessary between them now. Thomas nodded, then addressed Daniel in Lakota, his tone carrying the unmistakable cadence of instruction and caution. Daniel responded with respectful attention, clearly taking his father's words to heart. The journey to Eagle Ridge took most of the day. the three travelers moving at a steady pace through snow-covered terrain that grew increasingly familiar to Margaret as they approached the settlement. By late afternoon, they crested the final rise that overlooked the town, its buildings clustered together as if huddling against the winter cold. Margaret paused, taking in the sight of the place that had been her home for so long. From this distance, it looked unchanged. The same weathered structures, the same smoke rising from chimneys, the same corrals and outbuildings defining the edges of communal life. But she knew that inside those structures, everything had changed. Death or the fear of it stalked the streets, turning neighbor against neighbor, breaking the bonds of community that had once seemed unshakable. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked, quietly, having learned enough English during their time together to manage simple conversations without translation. Margaret straightened her shoulders, her hand unconsciously touching the beaded necklace now hidden beneath her Lakota coat. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready." Their arrival caused a stir, faces appearing at windows and doors as they made their way toward the town center. Margaret recognized most of them, people she had lived alongside for decades, whose births and marriages and deaths had formed the backdrop of her own life. Their expressions ranged from shock to relief to undisguised hostility, but she kept her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the scrutiny. The council hall stood at the center of town, its doors open despite the cold, people moving in and out with the harried expressions of those in the midst of crisis. Inside, cots had been set up to accommodate the overflow of sick from homes that could no longer manage their care. The air was thick with the smell of illness, sweat and medicine, and the underlying tang of fear. Robert Blackwood stood near the main table, deep in conversation with several other council members. He looked up as they entered, his expression flashing from surprise to calculation to a careful neutrality that didn't quite mask his discomfort. "Margaret," he acknowledged, his tone cautious, "we received word you were coming." "We've brought medicine," she replied, dispensing with pleasantries, "and knowledge to combat the fever." Robert's gaze traveled from her to her companions, lingering on Wichapi with poorly concealed suspicion. "This is the Lakota healer." "This is Wichapi," Margaret corrected firmly. "The medicine woman who will teach your doctor how to save your people, if you're wise enough to listen." A flush crept up Robert's neck at her directness, but whatever retort he might have made was interrupted by the arrival of the young doctor, his face gray with exhaustion. "Thank God you've come," he said, addressing Margaret with a desperation that spoke volumes about the severity of the situation. "We've lost 6 already, and 20 more show symptoms. I've tried everything I know." "Show me," Margaret instructed, setting aside personal grievances in the face of immediate need. The doctor led them deeper into the hall, where the most serious cases had been gathered. Daniel remained near the entrance, his posture alert and watchful, clearly uncomfortable, being surrounded by settlers, but determined to fulfill his role as protector. The next hours were a blur of activity as Margaret and Wichapi assessed the sick, prepared remedies from the supplies they had brought, and instructed the doctor and his assistant in their application. The fever was indeed severe, but not unlike ones Margaret had seen before. The combination of Lakota herbal knowledge and her own experience with settler illnesses proved effective. By nightfall, several of the patients showed signs of improvement. Throughout it all, Margaret was aware of being watched, not just by those receiving treatment, but by members of the community who had once called her friend. Some approached hesitantly to express gratitude or surprise at her return. Others kept their distance, their expressions guarded or openly hostile. Sarah Moon was among the first to seek her out, her normally vibrant presence diminished by worry over her husband, who lay among the sick. "We didn't know," she whispered to Margaret during a brief moment of privacy, "about the council's decision to send you away. By the time word spread, you were already gone. and the storm had hit. Many of us would have spoken against it if we'd known. Margaret wanted to believe her, but the comfort of potential allies came too late to erase the wound of betrayal. "Yet here I am," she replied, neither accepting nor rejecting the implicit apology, "doing what I've always done, caring for those in need." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "We were wrong. The council was wrong." Robert pushed the decision through. When half the members were absent, claimed it was an emergency measure that couldn't wait. This detail was new, and Margaret filed it away for future consideration. Robert Blackwood, it seemed, had engineered her expulsion with calculated precision, rather than as part of a genuinely collective decision. The knowledge didn't change what had happened, but it shifted the weight of responsibility from the community as a whole to a few powerful individuals. As night fell, Margaret and Wichapi continued their work, establishing a rotation of care with the doctor and volunteers who were willing to learn their methods. Daniel maintained his vigil near the entrance, accepting food when it was offered, but otherwise keeping to himself, his dark eyes missing nothing of the settlers' interactions. It was near midnight when Robert Blackwood approached Margaret again, his manner oddly hesitant for a man who typically projected such confident authority. "The council would speak with you," he said, gesturing toward a side room where several elderly settlers had gathered, "to discuss terms for continued assistance." Margaret glanced at Wichapi, who was demonstrating a poultice application to the doctor. The medicine woman nodded slightly, indicating she could manage without Margaret for a time. "Very well," Margaret agreed, following Robert into the room where Eagle Ridge's remaining leadership awaited. She recognized them all, men and women who had once valued her contributions to community life, however grudgingly. Now they regarded her with a mixture of desperation and resentment, their pride wounded by their need for help from someone they had discarded. "Margaret," began Abigail Fletcher, William's wife, and one of the few women on the council, "we're grateful for your assistance in this crisis." "Are you grateful to me, Abigail?" Margaret asked pointedly. "Or to the Lakota, who took me in when my own people left me to die?" An uncomfortable silence followed her question. Several council members shifted in their seats, unwilling to meet her gaze directly. "Both," Abigail answered finally, her honesty more refreshing than the platitudes Margaret had expected. "We're grateful to both, and ashamed of the decision that was made in haste and fear." "Not by all of us," added George Miller, the elderly blacksmith who had consistently advocated for more peaceful relations with native peoples. "Some of us opposed the measure, but were outvoted." Margaret acknowledged this with a slight nod. It didn't change what had happened, but it mattered that not everyone had been complicit in her abandonment. "What terms are you seeking?" she asked, bringing the conversation back to its ostensible purpose. Chief Running Wolf was clear about his expectations. Robert cleared his throat. "We're prepared to exchange medical knowledge, as requested. Our doctor will share everything he knows with the Lakota healer." "And the council in spring," Margaret pressed, noting his careful avoidance of Wichapi's name or title. "Will Eagle Ridge send representatives to meet with the Lakota as equals?" This was clearly the sticking point, as several council members exchanged glances laden with unspoken reservations. The prospect of formal recognition, of treating with the Lakota as a sovereign power with equal standing, challenged fundamental assumptions about settler superiority that undergirded their society. "We would consider sending observers," Robert offered cautiously, "to hear what they have to say." Margaret shook her head. "Not observers. Representatives with authority to speak for Eagle Ridge, to negotiate agreements that both sides will honor. That is the price for our continued help." "You say our as if you're one of them now," Robert observed, his tone sharp with accusation. "Have you forgotten where you come from?" "I haven't forgotten anything," Margaret replied evenly, "including who stood by while I was sent to die and who risked their lives to save mine. If you want to discuss loyalty, Robert, perhaps we should begin there." George raised a hand, forestalling further confrontation. "The fever is spreading. We don't have the luxury of pride or position now. If formal representation at their council is the price for saving our people, then we must pay it." One by one, the other council members nodded reluctantly. Even Robert, seeing the way sentiment was turning, gave a tight nod of assent. "Then it's settled," Margaret said, rising from her seat. "We'll continue treating your sick. And the doctor. We'll work with Wichapi to learn our methods. When spring comes, Eagle Ridge will send representatives to the Lakota Council Fire, prepared to discuss how both communities can survive and thrive on shared land." As she turned to leave, Abigail spoke again. "Margaret, will you stay? When this is over, your home is still there, empty since you left. It could be yours again." The question caught Margaret off guard. She had not considered the possibility of returning permanently to Eagle Ridge, of reclaiming her place in settler society. The thought held little appeal now. "My home is with the people who value me," she said simply. "I'll stay until the crisis is past, but then I return to Pine Creek." The work continued through the night and into the following days as more fell. Ill before the tide began to turn, Margaret and Wichapi moved between households, treating the sick, instructing family members in proper care, and gradually transferring their knowledge to the young doctor, who proved an eager student despite his initial skepticism of native remedies. Daniel remained a steady presence throughout, his initial wariness slowly giving way to cautious engagement with those settlers who showed him respect. Several of the younger residents in particular seemed fascinated by his presence, peppering him with questions about Lakota life that he answered with increasing confidence in his improving English. By the end of the first week, the crisis had visibly abated. The number of new cases declined, and most of those already infected were showing signs of recovery. The atmosphere in Eagle Ridge shifted accordingly, the panic that had gripped the community giving way to exhausted relief. It was during this period of transition that the true test of the agreement came. As immediate survival concerns receded, old prejudices began to resurface among certain segments of the population. Comments were made within Margaret's hearing about Indian magic and savage practices. The same knowledge that had saved lives now reduced to superstition or exoticism in the minds of those who couldn't reconcile their worldview with gratitude to people they had been taught to consider inferior. James Blackwood, who had returned from his mission to find his father apparently capitulating to Lakota demands, became particularly vocal in his dissent. He gathered like-minded young men at the tavern, their heated discussions carrying into the street where Margaret and her companions couldn't help but overhear. "First, we're supposed to be grateful for their help," he argued one evening, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "Next, they'll want our land, our women, everything we've built here." Daniel, who had been assisting Margaret with preparing medicines, stiffened at the words, but said nothing. His self-control impressed Margaret, who felt her own anger rising at the ingratitude and ignorance on display. "Some people's hearts can only hold one truth at a time," she told him quietly, "and they've been taught all their lives that your people are their enemies. It's easier to cling to that belief than to remake their understanding of the world. My father says such people are like trees grown in rocky soil," Daniel replied, his English careful but increasingly fluent. "Their roots cannot go deep, so they are easily toppled by strong winds." "Your father is a wise man," Margaret acknowledged, once again struck by the profound differences in how the two cultures approached knowledge and understanding. The confrontation, when it finally came, was both inevitable and unexpected. In its specifics, Margaret was walking from the council hall to Sarah Moon's home, where several recovering patients needed attention, when she encountered James and 3 companions blocking her path. Wichapi had remained behind with the doctor, and Daniel was helping at another household, leaving Margaret alone for the first time since their arrival. "Going somewhere, traitor?" James asked, his stance deliberately intimidating as he stepped into her path. The smell of alcohol hung about him and his friends, explaining their boldness, if not excusing it. "I'm going to treat the sick," Margaret replied evenly, refusing to show fear despite the pounding of her heart, "as I've been doing since I arrived." "Playing at being an Indian witch," one of James's companions sneered. "Turning your back on your own kind." Margaret straightened to her full height, drawing on a lifetime of frontier hardiness that not even age had diminished. "My kind, as you put it, left me to die in a snowstorm. I owe them nothing. Now stand aside." She moved to step around them, but James grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into flesh, already bruised by days of relentless work. "You don't give orders here anymore, old woman," he hissed. "You and your savage friends will be gone as soon as the sick are on their feet. The council may have made promises, but promises to Indians don't need keeping." The naked contempt in his voice, combined with the physical threat of his grip, sparked something in Margaret that transcended fear. All the accumulated pain of betrayal, all the fury at being discarded after a lifetime of service, crystallized into a cold, clear anger that steadied her voice and straightened her spine. "Take your hand off me," she said quietly, but with such force that James actually loosened his grip in surprise. "I have watched children like you grow, from squalling infants into men, and I can tell you this. A man would not threaten an elder who came to save his people. A man would not break faith with those who offered help when it was most needed. What stands before me now is not a man, but a frightened boy playing at bravery with drink and cruelty." James's face flushed dark with rage. He raised his hand, as if to strike her, but before the blow could fall, another hand caught his wrist in mid-air. Daniel stood beside them, his arrival so silent that neither Margaret nor the young men had noticed his approach. His expression was calm, but his grip on James's wrist was implacable. "This elder is under the protection of Chief Running Wolf," he said clearly, his English precise and measured. "To harm her is to declare war on the Lakota nation." The simple statement, delivered without heat, but with absolute conviction, seemed to penetrate even James's alcohol-fueled belligerence. He yanked his arm free, taking a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered. But the threat rang hollow as he and his companions retreated, unwilling to press the confrontation further with a sober and clearly capable opponent. When they were gone, Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said to Daniel, "though I'm not sure that will be the end of it." "No," Daniel agreed soberly. "Such men do not forget perceived humiliation easily, but they will think twice before challenging you openly." Again, the incident crystallized something for Margaret, the realization that despite the council's formal agreement, despite the lives saved and knowledge shared, the deeper change they had hoped to initiate would not come easily or quickly. There would always be those like James who clung to old hatreds, who saw cooperation as weakness and compromise as surrender. But there would also be those like the young doctor who had come to regard Wichapi with genuine respect, like Sarah Moon, who had acknowledged the wrong done to Margaret and sought to make amends, like the children who crowded around Daniel with curiosity rather than fear, absorbing a different narrative than the one their parents had been raised on. Small changes, as Thomas had said. Ripples in still water, spreading outward in ways that couldn't always be predicted or controlled. As the crisis continued to abate and the immediate danger passed, Margaret found herself increasingly drawn back to thoughts of the Lakota camp, of the place she had begun to think of as home. The familiarity of Eagle Ridge now felt somehow hollow, its streets and buildings mere shells without the connections that had once given them meaning. The evening before their planned departure, with most patients either recovered or well on their way to recovery, Margaret sat with Sarah Moon by her kitchen fire, sharing a rare moment of quiet reflection. "You really won't stay?" Sarah asked, echoing Abigail Fletcher's earlier question. "Even after all this, the way you've saved so many of us, there must be a place for you here." Margaret considered her response carefully. "There could be," she acknowledged, "but it wouldn't be the same place I left. Too much has changed, in the settlement and in me." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think I understand. You found something among the Lakota that was missing here." "I found respect," Margaret said simply, "not despite my age, but because of it. I found purpose that draws on all I've learned through a lifetime of experience, rather than measuring my worth only by what physical labor I can still perform." "We were wrong," Sarah repeated her earlier assertion, this time with deeper conviction. "And many of us know it now, but I understand why you can't come back to stay." Maisu. The following morning, as Margaret, Wichapi, and Daniel prepared for departure, a small crowd gathered to see them off. Most of the council was present, along with many of those who had benefited directly from their care. Robert Blackwood stood somewhat apart, his expression still guarded, but lacking the open hostility of their first encounters. Abigail Fletcher stepped forward, acting as spokesperson for the group. "We have prepared supplies for your journey," she said, indicating several packed bags that had been set aside, "and tokens of our gratitude for Chief Running Wolf and his people." A small wooden chest sat beside the supplies, its contents unnamed, but presumably valuable enough to represent a genuine acknowledgement of the debt owed. "The council has also confirmed," Abigail continued, her voice carrying clearly to ensure all present would bear witness, "that when spring comes, representatives will travel to the Lakota camp for the council fire. As agreed, we will honor our promise." Margaret nodded, accepting this commitment at face value, despite the doubts that lingered. Perhaps it would be kept, perhaps not. The true test would come with the thaw, when immediate memories of the fever had faded and other concerns reasserted themselves. "One more thing," Abigail added, signaling to someone in the crowd. The young doctor stepped forward, carrying a leather-bound book. "Dr. Thompson has compiled his medical knowledge as promised. He will accompany you to continue the exchange with your healer." This was an unexpected addition, but a welcome one. The doctor's willingness to travel to the Lakota camp, to immerse himself in their practices, rather than simply receiving instruction at a distance, represented exactly the kind of meaningful exchange they had hoped to foster. As final farewells were exchanged, and the small party prepared to depart, Margaret found herself approached by Robert Blackwood, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings. "You won't be coming back," he said, a statement rather than a question. "Not to stay," Margaret confirmed, "though perhaps to visit if relations between our communities continue to improve." Robert nodded, his expression unreadable. "What you did here, it won't be forgotten." It wasn't quite an apology, nor was it exactly gratitude, but coming from a man who had been instrumental in her expulsion, it represented a significant shift in perspective. Margaret accepted it as such. "See that it isn't," she replied simply, "especially when spring comes and decisions must be made about honoring promises." With that, she turned away, joining her companions as they began the journey back to Pine Creek. The weight of Eagle Ridge seemed to lift from her shoulders with each step away from the settlement, replaced by a growing sense of anticipation as they moved toward the place where she had found unexpected belonging. Thomas was waiting when they arrived, standing at the edge of the encampment as if he had known exactly when they would return. Perhaps he had. There was much about Lakota ways that Margaret was still learning, still trying to understand without imposing settler frameworks on experiences that existed outside them. "You return changed," he observed as they approached. "All of you." It was true, Margaret realized. The experience had marked them all. Daniel with a new confidence in navigating between worlds, Wichapi with an expanded arsenal of healing knowledge, and herself with a deeper understanding of where she truly belonged. "The fever is broken," she reported, "and promises have been made for spring." Thomas nodded, his eyes traveling to the young doctor who had accompanied them. "And you have brought us a guest." "Dr. Thompson wishes to continue learning from Wichapi," Margaret explained, "and to share his own knowledge in return." As winter deepened, the Pine Creek encampment settled into a rhythm that now included Margaret as an integral part of daily life. The young Dr. Thompson remained with them, his initial awkwardness gradually giving way to genuine curiosity, as he worked alongside Wichapi, learning remedies and techniques that his medical training had never considered. Margaret often served as a bridge between them, translating not just language, but concepts and approaches that had no direct equivalence in either culture. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, but within the lodges, warmth and community flourished despite the hardships of winter on the plains. Margaret found herself busy from sunrise to sunset, working with Wichapi to prepare medicinal stores, helping the women process what limited game the hunters brought in, and spending hours with the tribe's elders, exchanging stories and knowledge that transcended the boundaries between their worlds. It was during one such gathering, as the elders sat together in Black Elk's lodge, sharing a pipe and tales of winters past, that Margaret realized how completely her perspective had shifted. She no longer thought of herself as a settler temporarily, sheltered among the Lakota, but as someone who belonged here, not despite her differences, but because they valued what those differences brought to the community. "The cold moons teach us patience," Black Elk was saying, his words translated by Daniel, who had appointed himself Margaret's constant interpreter. "When we cannot hunt, when we cannot travel, we turn inward to the stories and wisdom that sustain us through darkness." Margaret nodded, understanding more deeply than she might have before her expulsion from Eagle Ridge. In the settlement, winter was always seen as an enemy to be endured, she offered, something to fight against and survive, rather than a teacher. Black Elk's weathered face creased in a smile. "This is why your people struggle so, grandmother. They fight what cannot be fought, instead of learning what it has to teach." The simple observation contained a profound truth about the differences in their worldviews. Settlers approached the land as something to be conquered and bent to human will. The Lakota saw themselves as part of a larger whole, adapting to, rather than attempting to control the natural world. Both approaches had their strengths and weaknesses, but Margaret had come to appreciate the wisdom in the Lakota perspective that she had previously dismissed as primitive or superstitious. Thomas found her later that evening as she sat by the central fire, her hands busy with mending while her mind wandered through the day's conversations. "You are thoughtful tonight," he observed, settling beside her. "I was thinking about different ways of seeing the world," Margaret admitted, "and how blind I was to certain truths before coming here." Thomas nodded, adding a piece of wood to the fire. "It is difficult to see beyond the teachings of one's youth," he said. "Many never do." "Yet you saw something in me worth saving," Margaret replied, the question that had lingered since her rescue finally finding voice. "Why? Beyond simple kindness to a stranger, why did you bring me into your people's life so completely?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the weight of considered thought rather than hasty reassurance. "I saw in you what my own people sometimes forget, that wisdom comes not just from tradition, but from experience. You have lived a different life, walked different paths. The knowledge you carry complements our own." He looked at her directly then, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "And perhaps the spirits guided you to us because we needed what you bring as much as you needed what we could offer." The simple explanation resonated with Margaret's own growing sense of purpose. She had found not just shelter among the Lakota, but a role that honored her lifetime of experience, rather than dismissing it as irrelevant in the face of diminished physical capacity. "The eagle sees far," Thomas continued, using a metaphor she had come to recognize as central to Lakota teaching. "But the fox knows the ground. Both kinds of knowing are necessary for survival." Margaret smiled at the comparison. "And which am I in this story? Eagle or fox?" Thomas's lips curved slightly. "Perhaps a little of both, grandmother, as are we all, if we're wise enough to see it." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the encampment, voices raised in alarm, the sound of running. Feet on frozen ground. Thomas rose immediately, his posture alert and concerned. Margaret followed more slowly, her aging joints protesting the sudden movement after hours of sedentary work. A hunting party had returned early, carrying one of their members on a hastily constructed travois. The injured man, a young hunter named Swift Deer, had been gored by a buffalo that the party had tracked for miles before finally bringing it down. The wound was severe, a deep puncture in his thigh that had torn through muscle and possibly damaged the bone beneath. Wichapi was already kneeling beside the travois, her skilled hands moving with practiced efficiency as she examined the injury. Dr. Thompson joined her moments later, his medical bag clutched tightly as he knelt in the snow on the wounded man's other side. Margaret watched as they worked together, communicating through gestures and the few Lakota words Thompson had managed to learn. It was a striking tableau. The elderly medicine woman with her traditional remedies, and the young doctor with his modern training, both focused entirely on saving the life before them, their different approaches complementing rather than conflicting with each other. Swift Deer was carried to Wichapi's lodge, where better light and warmth would aid in treating his wounds. Margaret followed, knowing her assistance would be needed, not just for translation, but for the practical knowledge she had gained from decades of frontier medicine where doctors were scarce and emergencies common. The night that followed was long and difficult. Swift Deer's wound became infected despite their best efforts, fever setting in with frightening speed. Wichapi prepared poultices of herbs known for their purifying properties, while Thompson cleaned the wound repeatedly with alcohol from his medical supplies and administered laudanum to ease the young man's pain. Margaret moved between them, suggesting combinations of their techniques that might prove more effective than either approach alone. By dawn, the crisis had passed. Swift Deer slept fitfully, but his fever had broken, and the angry red streaks that had begun to radiate from his wound had receded. Thompson sat back on his heels, exhaustion etched into his young face. "I've never seen an infection reverse so quickly," he admitted, looking at Wichapi with newfound respect. "The herbs in your poultice, I need to learn more about them." Margaret translated, and Wichapi nodded, her expression solemn but satisfied. She spoke at length, her gnarled hands gesturing to emphasize particular points. "She says the plants speak to those who know how to listen," Margaret translated, trying to capture the nuance of Wichapi's explanation. "Each has its purpose, its strength. The knowledge has been gathered over many generations, passed from healer to healer." Thompson nodded, his scientific skepticism visibly wrestling with the evidence of success before him. "There must be compounds in the plants that have antibacterial properties," he mused, "something that fights infection in ways our modern medicine is only beginning to understand." Margaret didn't bother translating this to Wichapee, the medicine. Woman cared little for the theoretical frameworks that explained why her remedies worked, only that they did. It was another fundamental difference in approach that Margaret had come to appreciate during her time with the Lakota. Western medicine sought to understand mechanisms. Traditional healing focused on results and relationships. As they left Swift Dear to rest under the watchful eye of his family, Thompson turned to Margaret, his expression thoughtful. "If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it," he admitted. "The combination of our techniques saved him when either alone might have failed." "Two kinds of knowing," Margaret replied, echoing Thomas's earlier words. "Both necessary for survival." Thompson looked at her curiously. "You've changed since coming here," he observed. "You seem at peace in a way you never were in Eagle Ridge, even before." He trailed off, uncomfortable with referencing her expulsion directly. "Before I was cast out to die," Margaret finished for him, her tone matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Yes, I have changed. I've found a place where my age is seen as an asset rather than a liability, where what I know matters more than what I can physically do." The young doctor had the grace to look ashamed. "For what it's worth, many of us regret what happened, not just because you've helped us since, but because it was wrong." Margaret acknowledged this with a slight nod. Regret after the fact was easy. Standing against injustice when it happened required more courage than many possessed. She had learned to accept the reality of human weakness without letting it poison her remaining years. The successful treatment of Swift Deer marked a turning point in the relationship between Dr. Thompson and the Lakota healers. Where before he had observed with clinical detachment, he now engaged with genuine interest, his questions becoming more nuanced as he sought to understand not just what they did, but why and how it connected to larger patterns of health and illness. For her part, Wichapee began to incorporate some of Thompson's techniques into her practice, particularly his emphasis on cleanliness and precise measurement of dosages, concepts that enhanced rather than contradicted her traditional approaches. It was a small but significant example of the kind of exchange Thomas had envisioned when he first welcomed Margaret into the tribe. Knowledge flowing in both directions, enriching rather than diminishing either culture. As winter reached its deepest point, food became increasingly scarce. The buffalo that had injured Swift Deer had provided temporary relief, but game was sparse and the stores of preserved food were dwindling faster than anticipated. Margaret noticed the portions at communal meals growing smaller, the hunters returning more often empty-handed. The worry etched in the faces of mothers as they watched their children eat. Thomas called a council to discuss the situation, inviting Margaret to attend not just as an observer, but as a participant. The elders gathered in his lodge, the atmosphere somber as they considered their options. "The hunting grounds to the north are empty," reported one of the senior hunters, his face gaunt from too many days of tracking prey that wasn't there. "The deer have moved further into the foothills than we can safely follow with the snow so deep. Our stores will last perhaps another moon," added a woman responsible for managing the tribe's food supplies. "Less if the weather worsens and we need more fuel for warmth." Margaret listened as various suggestions were made, sending hunting parties further afield, reducing rations even further, moving the entire camp to follow the game despite the dangers of winter travel. None seemed to offer a sustainable solution. For the weeks that remained before spring would bring relief. When the others had spoken, Thomas turned to Margaret. "You have been quiet, grandmother. What wisdom do you offer from your experience?" Margaret considered carefully before responding. "In Eagle Ridge, during particularly hard winters, we supplemented our diet with parts of animals that aren't usually eaten. Marrow from bones, organs that are typically discarded, even hides that can be processed to extract nutrition." She hesitated, unsure how such suggestions would be received. I also know ways to extract sustenance from certain trees. The inner bark of pines, for instance, can be ground into a flour of sorts. To her relief, her suggestions were met with thoughtful consideration rather than dismissal. Several of the elders nodded, recognizing the practical value in her recommendations. The old ones spoke of such practices during the hunger times, Black Elk confirmed, but the knowledge has grown thin with the passing of generations. I can show you, Margaret offered. Working with what you already know, we might find better ways to use what little we have. Thomas nodded his approval. It will be done. The women will work with Margaret to find these additional sources of food. The discussion continued, moving on to matters of rationing and distribution, ensuring that the weakest and youngest would be prioritized without undermining the strength of hunters who needed energy to pursue game. Throughout, Margaret was struck by the communal approach to problem solving. No one suggested abandoning the elderly or infirm to save resources, as had happened to her in Eagle Ridge. Instead, the focus remained on how the community as a whole would weather the crisis, with sacrifice shared equally among all members. In the days that followed, Margaret worked closely with the women of the tribe, showing them how to extract marrow from bones that would normally have been discarded after the primary meat was consumed, how to process certain parts of the buffalo's digestive system to retrieve partially digested plant matter that still contained nutrients, how to identify and harvest the inner bark of specific trees without killing them. Some of these practices were familiar to the older women, echoing techniques their grandmothers had used during previous hunger times. Others were new, adaptations Margaret had developed during her years on the frontier. The exchange was reciprocal. Margaret, learning which local plants remained viable food sources even in deep winter, which could be processed to remove bitterness or toxins, which provided the most energy for the least effort in harvesting. Dr. Thompson joined these efforts, contributing his knowledge of nutrition and digestion to help identify which combinations of foods might provide the most complete sustenance. It was another example of integration rather than imposition, scientific understanding, enhancing rather than replacing traditional knowledge. The impact of these combined efforts was gradual but significant. While no one had enough to feel truly satisfied, the immediate threat of starvation receded. Hunting parties continued to range widely in search of game, but the pressure to return with meat lessened somewhat as alternative food sources were developed. It was during this period of relative stability that a messenger arrived from Eagle Ridge, James Blackwood, the same young man who had threatened Margaret before her departure. He rode into the camp alone, his posture tense but determined, clearly uncomfortable in Lakota territory, but driven by some urgent purpose. Thomas received him formally, with Daniel and Margaret present to translate and provide context. James dismounted stiffly, his gaze darting around the encampment as if expecting an attack from any quarter. "I bring word from the council," he announced without preamble. "Eagle Ridge faces starvation. Our stores are nearly depleted, and illness has weakened many. The council requests aid, as promised in our agreement." Margaret translated his words. For Thomas, who regarded the young man with careful neutrality. "What aid do they seek?" he asked through Margaret. "We have little food to spare ourselves." James shifted uncomfortably. "Not food," he clarified. "Knowledge. The techniques that Margaret and Dr. Thompson have been sharing with your people. Ways to find nutrition in what we would normally discard. Methods to supplement our remaining supplies. The council asks that Margaret return, at least temporarily, to teach these skills to our people." The request caught Margaret by surprise. She had not expected Eagle Ridge to invoke the agreement so soon, nor to specifically request her presence, rather than simply asking for information to be shared. Thomas seemed equally taken aback, though his expression revealed little of his thoughts. "This is not a small thing, they ask," he said finally. "Margaret is one of us now, not a resource to be borrowed and returned at convenience." James bristled at the implied criticism. "The council acknowledges its debt," he said stiffly. "They offer trade goods in exchange for her temporary return, ammunition, tools, cloth. And they reaffirm their commitment to send representatives to the Spring Council." Margaret considered the situation carefully. Her feelings toward Eagle Ridge remained complicated, resentment for her abandonment tempered by concern for those who had played no part in that decision, particularly the children and elderly who would suffer most from food shortages. "I will go," she said finally, speaking directly to Thomas rather than James. "Not because Eagle Ridge has any claim on me, but because hunger does not distinguish between those who have wronged and those who are innocent." Thomas studied her face, seeming to search for any sign of hesitation or coercion. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "You will not go alone," he declared. "Daniel will accompany you, along with 2 others, and you will return before the moon completes its cycle." It was both a concession and a statement of terms. Margaret would help Eagle Ridge, but on the Lakota's timeline and with their protection. James looked as if he might protest these conditions, but something in Thomas's implacable expression dissuaded him. "The council will agree to these terms," he said instead, his tone suggesting he had little choice in the matter. Preparations for the journey were made quickly. Whichapi insisted on sending a supply of medicinal herbs with Margaret. Knowing that hunger often led to illness, as people consumed foods their bodies were not accustomed to processing. Dr. Thompson chose to remain with the Lakota, continuing his work with Whichapi while Margaret was gone. "I can be more useful here," he explained when Margaret questioned his decision. "And frankly, I'm learning more in a week with Whichapi than I did in a year of medical school. I don't want to interrupt that." The night before her departure, Margaret sat with Thomas by the central fire, her thoughts turning to what awaited her in Eagle Ridge. So much had changed since she had last set foot in the settlement, not just in her circumstances, but in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. "You are concerned," Thomas observed, reading her silence with the perceptiveness she had come to expect from him. "I am uncertain," Margaret corrected, echoing her response from months earlier when preparing to return to Eagle Ridge to treat the fever. "About how I will be received, about whether any real change is possible in how they think and live." Thomas nodded, accepting her distinction. "Change comes slowly to those who believe they already possess all wisdom," he said. "But hunger is a harsh teacher. It may open ears that have long been closed. And if it doesn't, if they take what knowledge I bring and return to their old ways once their immediate need is met?" Thomas considered this, his expression thoughtful. "In the firelight, then that is their choice and their loss. But you will have honored your own spirit by offering help despite past wrongs, and you will always have a home here with us." The simple reassurance settled something in Margaret that had been restless since James's arrival. Whatever happened, in Eagle Ridge, she would not again be at the mercy of their judgment. She had found her true place among people who valued what she could contribute, who saw her worth beyond utility. The journey to Eagle Ridge took 2 days, slowed by the deep snow and the need to break trail for the horses. James rode ahead, visibly impatient with the pace but unwilling to leave the party behind. Daniel and the 2 warriors Thomas had assigned as escorts, Strong Shield and Running Hawk, maintained a vigilant perimeter around Margaret, their protective instincts heightened by the memory of how she had been treated by the settlement they were now approaching. Eagle Ridge came into view on the afternoon of the 2nd day, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear winter sky. From a distance, it looked unchanged. The same cluster of sturdy buildings huddled against the elements, the same corrals and outbuildings defining the boundaries of civilization against the wilderness. But as they drew closer, Margaret could see signs of hardship. Thin livestock in the barnyards, wood piles diminished to concerning levels, and most tellingly, the absence of people outdoors despite the relatively mild weather, suggesting a conservation of energy that spoke to significant food shortages. Their arrival caused less of a stir than Margaret had anticipated. A few faces appeared at windows, but there was none of the gathering crowd that had marked her return during the fever crisis. James led them directly to the council hall, where Robert Blackwood and several other council members awaited. "Margaret," Robert acknowledged, his tone carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming." The formal greeting, devoid of both warmth and hostility, set the tone for what followed, a business-like discussion of Eagle Ridge's needs and how Margaret's knowledge might address them. The settlement's food stores were indeed critically low, with at least 6 weeks remaining before spring plantings could begin. Game had grown scarce in the surrounding area, overhunted in the settlement's desperation for fresh meat. Families were subsisting on increasingly meager rations, with cases of malnutrition beginning to appear, particularly among the elderly and very young. Throughout the recitation of troubles, Margaret listened without comment, noting both what was said and what remained unspoken. There was no acknowledgement of the irony inherent in the situation that they now turned for help to a woman they had discarded as a useless burden when their own resources were threatened. Whether this omission stemmed from shame, pride, or simple pragmatism was unclear. When the council had finished outlining the situation, Margaret spoke clearly and directly. "I will show you methods to extend your remaining supplies, to find nutrition in sources you have overlooked, and to process foods you might normally consider inedible. But understand this, I do so not out of obligation to Eagle Ridge, but out of compassion for those who had no voice in my expulsion." Robert's jaw tightened at her directness, but he nodded acceptance of her terms. "What do you need to begin? Access to your slaughterhouse and butchering waste, permission to gather from the woodlands at the settlement's edge, and women willing to learn techniques that may initially seem strange or unpleasant," Margaret replied. "And I will need quarters for myself and my companions for the duration of our stay." This last requirement caused visible discomfort among several council members. Having Lakota warriors staying within the settlement boundaries clearly pushed against boundaries they were reluctant to cross, despite their desperate circumstances. "Surely your escorts could camp outside the settlement," James suggested, his tone making it clear he considered this a reasonable compromise. Daniel, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward slightly. "We stay with Margaret," he said firmly, his English clear and precise. "Those were Chief Running Wolf's instructions." Robert studied the young Lakota man with a mixture of resentment and calculation. Finally, he nodded. "The old schoolhouse is empty since we consolidated classes due to the teacher's illness. You can use that building during your stay." With accommodations settled, Margaret wasted no time in beginning her work. She first visited the settlement's slaughterhouse, where the meager remains of recently butchered animals were typically discarded or fed to dogs. With Daniel and Strong Shield accompanying her, she identified numerous parts that could be processed for human consumption. Bones that could be cracked for marrow or boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of nutrition. Organ meats that settlers typically avoided, but which contained vital nutrients, even hooves and hides, that could be processed into gelatin. The butcher, a gruff man named Peterson who had worked in Eagle Ridge for as long as Margaret could remember, watched with initial skepticism that gradually gave way to grudging interest as she demonstrated how to maximize the use of each animal. "Never thought of using that," he commented as Margaret showed him how to extract the thymus gland. what she called sweetbread from a freshly slaughtered calf. Always just threw it to the dogs. Many parts we discard actually contain the most concentrated nutrition, Margaret explained, working with practiced efficiency despite her age. Liver, heart, kidneys, all of them more nutrient-dense than the muscle meat we usually prefer. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense when you think about it. Just never did think about it, I guess. This pattern repeated throughout her first days back in Eagle Ridge. Initial skepticism followed by reluctant acknowledgement of the value in her methods. She worked with groups of women, showing them how to process inner bark from certain trees into a flour-like substance that could extend their dwindling supplies of real flour. How to identify which plants remained viable food sources even in winter. How to render every part of an animal useful rather than wasting potential nutrition. The settlement's relationship with her Lakota companions evolved more slowly. Daniel, Strong Shield and Running Hawk remained primarily within the schoolhouse, when not accompanying Margaret, their presence tolerated rather than welcomed by most settlers. But as days passed and Margaret's methods began to visibly impact the food situation, attitudes softened slightly. Children were the first to bridge the divide, their natural curiosity overcoming the learned wariness of their parents. They gathered around the schoolhouse, initially just watching from a distance, but gradually growing bold enough to approach with questions and requests for stories. Daniel, who had the most facility with English, became an unexpected ambassador, sharing simplified versions of Lakota tales and demonstrating small skills like whittling or making string figures that delighted his young audience. Sarah Moon was among the first adults to make genuine overtures of friendship, bringing hot meals to the schoolhouse and engaging Daniel in conversations about Lakota life and customs. Others followed gradually, their hunger for knowledge about their neighbors beginning to match their physical hunger as they realized how much they had to learn from a culture they had previously dismissed as primitive. Not everyone welcomed this cultural exchange. James Blackwood and a core group of like-minded young men maintained a hostile distance, their resentment at depending on Indian knowledge evident in their expressions and body language whenever they encountered Margaret or her companions. They were careful not to cross into open confrontation, but the potential for trouble simmered beneath the surface of daily interactions. The most significant shift came during a particularly harsh blizzard that descended without warning, trapping many settlers in the town center unable to return to outlying farms. The council hall became an impromptu shelter, with families huddled together for warmth as the wind howled outside. Margaret and her Lakota companions were among those caught by the storm, having been working with a group of women on food preservation techniques when it hit. As the evening wore on, and it became clear no one would be leaving until the storm passed, an uncomfortable silence fell over the hall. Settlers and Lakota regarded each other warily across the shared space, the forced proximity highlighting the tenuous nature of their cooperation. It was Daniel who broke the stalemate, surprisingly. He approached the central hearth where several children sat listening to an elderly settler tell a rather sanitized version of frontier history and asked politely if he might share a Lakota winter tale in return. The request created a moment of tension. Cultural sharing of this sort had not been part of the arrangement, and some parents moved protectively closer to their children. But the elderly storyteller, a man named Jenkins, who had always been among the more moderate voices in Eagle Ridge, nodded his permission. "Seems only fair to trade tales on a night like this," he said, gesturing for Daniel to take his place by the fire. What followed was a simple but powerful Lakota story about how the buffalo taught humans to survive winter's harshness. A tale that emphasized themes of respect for nature, community cooperation, and the wisdom of learning from those who had mastered survival in difficult environments. Daniel told it well, his English more than adequate to capture the story's essence, if not its every nuance. The children listened with rapt attention, their natural appreciation for a good story overriding any taught prejudices. When Daniel finished, there was a moment of appreciative silence before questions erupted, not just from children, but from adults who found themselves unexpectedly engaged by the tale's practical wisdom. Margaret watched this small breakthrough with a mixture of hope and caution. One story wouldn't erase generations of misunderstanding and conflict, but it represented the kind of exchange that Thomas had envisioned when he first welcomed her into the Lakota community. Knowledge flowing, both ways enriching rather than threatening either culture. As the storm raged on, more stories were shared. Settler tales of overcoming hardship, alternating with Lakota wisdom about living in harmony with the natural world. The atmosphere in the hall gradually shifted from tense coexistence to something approaching genuine interaction, a shared experience, creating temporary bridges across deep cultural divides. When the storm finally abated the following day, Margaret sensed a subtle shift in how her Lakota companions were perceived, not as foreign intrusions to be tolerated out of necessity, but as individuals with their own valid perspectives and knowledge. It was a small change, perhaps not even consciously recognized by most settlers, but significant nonetheless. The remaining weeks of their stay continued this pattern of gradual integration. Margaret's techniques for extending food supplies proved increasingly valuable as winter maintained its grip on the land. The settlers learned to use every part of slaughtered animals to identify and harvest plants they had previously overlooked, and to process foods in ways that maximized nutrition while minimizing waste. More importantly, they began to absorb some of the underlying philosophy that made these practices sustainable rather than merely expedient, an approach to resources that emphasized respect and relationship rather than simply extraction and consumption. It was this deeper learning that Margaret hoped would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. As the time for their departure approached, Margaret met with the council to ensure that the knowledge she had shared would continue to be applied after she left. She had deliberately worked with as many different community members as possible, dispersing skills widely rather than concentrating them among a few individuals who might guard them as special knowledge. The techniques will only serve you if they become part of how you think about food and resources, she explained to the assembled council members. Not emergency measures to be abandoned when times improve, but a different way of relating to what the land provides. Robert Blackwood, who had maintained a certain distance throughout her stay while never actively obstructing her work, spoke up unexpectedly. "You've given us more than just ways to survive this winter," he acknowledged, his tone lacking its usual defensive edge. "You've shown us what we failed to see before. That age brings its own kind of strength, different from youth, but no less valuable." The admission coming from the man who had been instrumental in her expulsion carried particular weight. Margaret accepted it with a simple nod, neither rejecting the implicit apology nor suggesting that it erased what had been done. "Remember that lesson when spring comes," she replied, "both in how you treat your own elders and in how you approach the Lakota Council fire. There is strength in different kinds of knowing if we have the wisdom to recognize it." The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, the sun casting long shadows across fresh snow that had fallen overnight. A small gathering assembled to see them off, not the formal council delegation that had marked their arrival, but a more organic collection of those who had worked most closely with Margaret and formed connections with her Lakota companions. Sarah Moon embraced her warmly. "You won't reconsider staying?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "My home is with the Lakota now," Margaret replied simply, "but I will return with them for the spring council, and perhaps visit from time to time if relations between our communities continue to improve." Others approached to express gratitude or make small parting gestures. Jars of preserved food for the journey, a handcrafted blanket, simple tokens of appreciation that meant more than any formal recognition. Even Peterson the butcher appeared, presenting Daniel with a carefully honed knife in acknowledgement of the young man's skill and knowledge. As they mounted their horses and prepared to depart, Robert Blackwood stepped forward one last time. "The council will honor its commitment," he stated formally. "When the snow melts, representatives of Eagle Ridge will come to the Lakota Council fire, prepared to discuss how we might live as neighbors rather than adversaries." Margaret met his gaze directly, searching for any sign of reservation or insincerity. Finding none, she nodded acknowledgement of the promise. Whether it would be kept remained to be seen, but the fact that it was made publicly before witnesses from both communities gave it a weight that private assurances lacked. With final farewells exchanged, they rode out, following the trail they had broken on their arrival. As Eagle Ridge receded behind them, Margaret felt a curious lightness, not the aching loss she might once have expected at leaving the settlement that had been her home for decades, but the quieter satisfaction of having completed a necessary task and now returning to where she truly belonged. Daniel rode beside her, his posture relaxed now that they were beyond the settlement boundaries. "You have changed them," he observed. "Not all and not completely, but some have begun to see with new eyes." "Perhaps," Margaret allowed, unwilling to claim too much from what might prove temporary shifts in attitude. "The true test will come in spring, when their need is less immediate and old habits reassert themselves. My father says that once a mind has been opened to new possibilities, it can never completely close again," Daniel replied. "Even if they resist, the knowledge you have shared has planted seeds that will grow in their thinking." Margaret hoped he was right. The work she had done in Eagle Ridge represented more than just practical techniques for survival. It embodied a different relationship with the land and its resources, a perspective that balanced immediate needs against long-term sustainability. If even some of that philosophy took root alongside the specific skills she had taught, it would represent a significant shift in how the settlement approached its place in the wider ecosystem. The journey back to the Lakota encampment was uneventful, the trail they had broken on their outward journey still visible beneath fresh snow. As they approached Pine Creek on the afternoon of the second day, Margaret felt a surge of emotion that caught her by surprise, the simple, powerful recognition of coming home. Thomas was waiting at the edge of the camp, as he had been when she returned from treating the fever months earlier. His presence, steady and unwavering, symbolized everything she had found among the Lakota: acceptance, respect, and a place of belonging that honored rather than diminished the person she had become in her later years. "You return to us whole," he observed as they dismounted, his eyes taking in her appearance with careful attention. "Whole and changed," Margaret acknowledged, "as are those we leave behind, though whether the change will last remains to be seen." Thomas nodded, accepting both the progress and the uncertainty. "Come," he said simply. "The council waits to hear your words." As they walked toward the center of the encampment, Daniel beside her and Thomas leading the way, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Cast out by one community for being too old to contribute physically, she had found another that valued the wisdom and knowledge her years had given her. In the process, she had become a bridge between worlds that had long regarded each other, with fear and suspicion opening possibilities for a different kind of relationship based on mutual respect and shared learning. Spring would bring new challenges as the Lakota prepared to receive representatives from Eagle Ridge at their council fire. The path toward genuine coexistence would not be smooth or straightforward. Old prejudices and conflicts would not disappear overnight, and some on both sides would resist any change to established patterns of interaction. But as Margaret took her place in the circle of elders, recognized and respected for the unique perspective she brought, she felt a quiet confidence that something fundamental had shifted, not just in her own life, but in the relationship between the communities that shared this harsh but beautiful land. The seeds of understanding had been planted. With care and patience, they might yet grow into something neither she nor Thomas could fully imagine, a new way of being neighbors that honored difference while recognizing common humanity. As the council fire blazed against the gathering dusk, Margaret Winters, once cast out as useless, now honored as an elder with valuable wisdom to share, began to tell her story, bridging worlds with words as she had bridged them with action, one step at a time. The days grew longer, the grip of winter gradually loosening as February gave way to March. Within the Pine Creek encampment, preparations for spring accelerated. Tools repaired, seed stores inspected, hunting parties venturing further afield. As game began to stir from winter territories, the food preservation techniques Margaret had introduced had helped them weather the leanest months, but everyone looked forward to fresh growth and more abundant hunting. Margaret divided her time between working with Wichapi to replenish medicinal supplies depleted by winter ailments and assisting with preparations for the planting season. Her knowledge of settler agriculture, particularly techniques for maximizing yields in difficult conditions, complemented traditional Lakota practices. Together, they developed approaches that incorporated the best of both traditions. Dr. Thompson had continued his integration into tribal life, his initially clinical interest in Lakota medicine evolving into deeper respect as he witnessed its effectiveness firsthand. He and Wichapi had developed a remarkable working relationship, documenting plant properties and treatment protocols in a leather-bound journal that combined scientific precision with traditional wisdom. "I could publish this when I return east," he told Margaret one evening as they reviewed his notes. "It would revolutionize our understanding of botanical medicine." Margaret studied his enthusiastic expression, noting how much he had changed from the uncertain young doctor who had first arrived with the fever victims. "Would your colleagues be receptive?" she asked, "or would they dismiss it as primitive?" "Superstition?" Thompson's expression sobered. "Some would, certainly, but others are beginning to recognize the limitations of our current approaches. Besides," he added with unexpected humor, "I have empirical evidence they can't easily dismiss." It was true. During his months with the Lakota, he had documented dozens of successful treatments using plant-based remedies that had no equivalents in his medical training. The combination of Wichapi's traditional knowledge and his scientific methodology had produced results that would be difficult for even the most skeptical physician to ignore completely. "Just be sure to give proper credit," Margaret cautioned. "Too often knowledge from native peoples is appropriated without acknowledgement." Thompson nodded seriously. "I've been thinking about that. Wichapi and I have discussed the possibility of her being credited as co-author, though there are practical challenges given publishing conventions." He looked troubled by this limitation, another sign of how his perspective had shifted during his time among the Lakota. As the snow began to melt in earnest, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden for months, anticipation for the spring and council grew. The agreement with Eagle Ridge called for representatives to come when the winter snows receded, a time that was rapidly approaching. Thomas convened regular meetings to prepare, ensuring that the Lakota would present a unified position despite internal differences regarding how much trust to extend to the settlers. Robert Blackwood remained the primary voice of caution, his deep skepticism of settler intentions undiminished despite his grudging acknowledgement of Margaret's contributions. "They will promise much when they stand before us," he warned during one council session. "But words spoken in front of witnesses are different from actions taken when we cannot see." Thomas acknowledged the concern with a thoughtful nod. This is why we must establish clear agreements with consequences understood by both sides, not threats but mutual commitments that benefit all who share these lands. Margaret, now a regular participant in council deliberations, found herself in an increasingly defined role as cultural interpreter, not just translating language, but helping each side understand the underlying assumptions and values that shaped the other's approach to negotiation and agreement. Settlers value written documents, she explained to the council elders. Their tradition places great importance on agreements that are set down in words that cannot change. Words that cannot change cannot adapt to new circumstances, Black Elk observed, highlighting a fundamental difference in perspective. This is why our agreements are renewed through ceremony and council, allowing wisdom to grow with experience. Perhaps there is room for both approaches, Margaret suggested. A written document that establishes core principles with provision for regular council meetings to address changing circumstances. Thomas seemed pleased with this proposal, recognizing it as a bridge between the different cultural approaches to commitment and trust. It was exactly the kind of integration he had envisioned when he first welcomed Margaret into the tribe, not abandoning traditional ways, but allowing them to evolve and adapt through selective incorporation of useful elements from settler culture. The first sign of Eagle Ridge's approach came on a clear morning in early April, when a scout reported riders approaching from the east. Thomas dispatched Daniel and several others to escort them to the encampment, a gesture that balanced hospitality with security. Margaret watched from the edge of the camp as the small delegation appeared on the horizon. 5 riders, led by William Fletcher, with James Blackwood notably absent. Her heart quickened at the sight, not from fear or anticipation of her own reaction, but from awareness of how much depended on this meeting. The foundation being laid now would shape relations between the communities for generations to come. Thomas joined her, his formal regalia marking the significance of the occasion. Eagle feathers adorned his hair, and he wore the beaded ceremonial vest that signified his role as chief and speaker for his people. "They have honored their promise to come," he observed, his tone neutral. "That is a beginning." "Yes," Margaret agreed, "though what follows will determine whether it's a true beginning or merely a gesture." William and his companions were brought to the center of the encampment, where an open space had been prepared for the council. The Lakota assembled in a semicircle, with Thomas at the center and the elders, including Margaret, flanking him in positions of honor. The settlers dismounted, looking uncomfortable but determined, their formal attire indicating their recognition of the occasion's importance. Thomas rose to welcome them, his words translated by Daniel for the benefit of the settlers who didn't. "Understand, Lakota. You come to our council fire as promised," he acknowledged. "The Lakota welcome those who keep their word." William stepped forward as spokesperson for Eagle Ridge. In the months since Margaret had last seen him, he seemed to have aged, his face more lined, his posture slightly stooped, as if the responsibility he carried weighed physically upon him. "Chief Running Wolf," he began, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "We come as representatives of Eagle Ridge Settlement to honor our agreement and to seek a new path forward between our peoples." The formal exchange of greetings continued, with both sides acknowledging the unusual nature of the gathering. Never before had Eagle Ridge sent official representatives to a Lakota council, treating with them as equals rather than as obstacles to be avoided or enemies to be feared. The mere fact of the meeting represented a significant shift in the relationship between the communities. Once the ceremonial welcomes were complete, Thomas invited William to speak first, following Lakota tradition that guests be given the opportunity to state their purpose before substantive discussions began. William cleared his throat, glancing. briefly at his companions before addressing the assembled Lakota directly. "Our communities have lived as neighbors for many years," he began, "but not as friends. We have viewed each other with suspicion and fear, competing for resources rather than finding ways to share the abundance this land can provide when properly tended." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Recent events have shown us the cost of this approach. Hunting territories would be designated with agreed-upon practices to minimize waste and ensure population sustainability. A buffer zone would be established along the creek that supplied both communities, with restrictions on tree cutting and livestock grazing to protect water quality. Regular exchanges of knowledge would be formalized, with both communities sharing techniques and information that might benefit the other." Margaret observed the negotiations with quiet satisfaction, noting how both sides worked to find common ground while still protecting their core interests and values. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, misunderstanding, and retreat to defensive positions. But the overarching commitment to building a different kind of relationship seemed genuine, at least among those present. As the sun began to set, Thomas called for a break in formal discussions. Food was shared, a communal meal that included dishes from both traditions, symbolic of the integration they were working to achieve. The atmosphere relaxed somewhat, allowing for more personal exchanges between individuals from the different communities. Margaret found herself approached by William during this interlude, his expression reflective as he looked out over the gathering. "I wouldn't have believed this possible 6 months ago," he admitted. "The idea of sitting in council with the Lakota as equals, sharing food and discussing shared future." He shook his head slightly. "It took a crisis to open our eyes." "Crisis reveals character," Margaret replied. "Both the flaws we prefer to ignore and the strengths we didn't know we possessed." William nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke implicit in her first observation. "I remember how you stood at Thomas's side when we came seeking help," he said quietly. "The woman we had cast out, standing with the people we had long feared, offering life instead of rightful vengeance. It changed something in how many of us see the world." "Not all," Margaret noted, thinking of James Blackwood and others, who remained entrenched in positions of hostility despite the Winters' lessons. "No, not all," William agreed. "Change never comes all at once, or to everyone equally, but it has begun, and that's more than I would have dared hope." The negotiations resumed the following day, with attention turning to how agreements would be maintained and disputes resolved. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect, given the different cultural approaches to commitment and enforcement. "Our way is through council and consensus," Thomas explained. "When disagreements arise, elders from both sides gather to find a path forward that honors the spirit of our agreement, even if specific terms must adapt to new circumstances." William trained in settler legal traditions that emphasized fixed terms and penalties for violations, initially found this approach concerning. Without clear consequences for breaking the agreement, what prevents either side from ignoring provisions that become inconvenient? He asked. It was Margaret who bridged this conceptual divide, drawing on her understanding of both cultural frameworks. "Think of it as the difference between a fence and a path," she suggested. "Settler agreements are like fences, rigid boundaries with penalties for crossing them. Lakota agreements are more like paths, flexible routes towards shared destinations, maintained through regular use and collective commitment to the journey." She turned to Thomas. "But paths can become overgrown if not maintained." Then back to William. "And fences can fail if they're not adapted to changing conditions." This framing helped both sides conceptualize a hybrid approach. A written document, that established core principles and specific initial arrangements, combined with regular council meetings where representatives from both communities would address emerging issues and adapt specific practices as needed. Twice each year, Thomas proposed, when the first green appears in spring and when the leaves begin to fall in autumn, representatives from both peoples will meet to renew our commitment and address any concerns that have arisen. William considered this, then nodded agreement, and between these councils, we establish a way for urgent matters to be brought to immediate attention rather than waiting for the formal gathering. By the end of the second day, a framework had been established, not a final document, but a shared understanding of principles and practices that would guide future relations. William would take this framework back to the full Eagle Ridge Council for ratification, while Thomas would continue discussions with the Lakota elders to ensure broad support within the tribe. That evening, as the settlers prepared to depart, the following morning, a ceremony was held to mark the significance of what had been accomplished. The Lakota built a large central fire around which both communities gathered. Thomas and William each placed a token in the flames. Thomas, a small pouch of tobacco, a traditional offering. William, a piece of paper on which the key points of their agreement had been written. Not to destroy the agreement, William explained as murmurs of concern rose from some settlers, but to symbolize that what matters is not the paper itself, but the commitment it represents, a commitment we carry in our hearts and minds rather than merely in written words. It was a powerful gesture of recognition and respect for Lakota traditions, one that clearly impressed the tribal elders. Even Robert Blackwood, who had maintained a skeptical distance throughout the proceedings, nodded slightly in acknowledgement of its significance. Following the offering, Black Elk led a ceremony of pipe sharing, a sacred ritual that traditionally sealed important agreements among the Lakota. That William and the other representatives participated without hesitation, accepting the pipe when it was passed to them and drawing the smoke as instructed, was perhaps the clearest indication of how far relations had progressed from the mutual suspicion and disdain that had characterized previous interactions. Songs were shared from both traditions, Lakota honor songs that acknowledged the ancestors and spiritual forces that guided human affairs, followed by settler hymns that expressed gratitude and hope for the future. The music bridged linguistic barriers, creating a sense of shared experience that transcended the specific content of either tradition. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself seated between cultures once again, but now as a bridge rather than an exile. Young settlers approached to ask questions about Lakota customs, while tribal members inquired about aspects of settlement life they had observed but not understood. Her role as cultural interpreter had expanded beyond the formal negotiations to include these more personal exchanges, each small conversation another thread in the fabric of understanding being woven between the communities. Daniel joined her as the gathering began to disperse, fires burning low as families returned to their lodges or the temporary accommodations provided for the settler representatives. His expression was thoughtful as he watched the intermingling of peoples who had so recently regarded each other primarily as threats. "My father says this is how it should have been from the beginning," he observed. "Not fear and mistrust, but recognition that different ways of knowing can strengthen rather than threaten each other." Perhaps it couldn't have happened without the crises that brought us together, Margaret suggested. Sometimes we need to be shaken out of old patterns before we can see new possibilities. Daniel nodded, considering this. The winter that nearly took your life became the season that gave new life to both our peoples. The observation struck Margaret with its simple profundity. Her personal journey, from rejection to rescue to respected elder, had somehow become intertwined with a larger transformation in the relationship between communities that had long existed in a state of uneasy tension. The very vulnerability that Eagle Ridge had deemed a liability had become an asset, enabling her to move between worlds and help create understanding where there had been only fear and ignorance. Morning brought departure preparations for the Eagle Ridge representatives, who would carry the framework agreement back to their full council for consideration. Margaret watched as William conferred one last time with Thomas, the two leaders, speaking directly rather than through translators, each making the effort to bridge the remaining language gap through a combination of simplified speech and expressive gestures. "We will return before the moon completes its next cycle," William promised, indicating a time frame of approximately 4 weeks, with the full council's response to what we have discussed. Thomas nodded, his expression conveying both hope and caution. "We will be waiting," he replied. "May your journey be safe and your words find receptive ears." As the settlers mounted their horses and prepared to depart, Margaret stepped forward. She had been pondering a possibility throughout the negotiations, one that might further strengthen the fragile bonds being established between the communities. "William," she called, approaching his horse, "when you return, I would like to accompany you back to Eagle Ridge for a time." Both William and Thomas looked surprised by this announcement, though for different reasons. "You would return to the settlement?" William asked, clearly uncertain why she would choose to revisit the community that had cast her out. "Not permanently," Margaret clarified, "but to help establish some of the practical aspects of our agreement, particularly the exchanges of knowledge about medicine, food preservation, and sustainable farming practices. Dr. Thompson can assist with medical training, but there are other areas where my experience bridging both traditions might be useful." Thomas studied her face, perhaps searching for any sign of coercion or uncertainty in her proposal. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "You speak your own mind and heart, as always," he acknowledged. "If this is your wish, the Lakota support your journey." William seemed both relieved and genuinely pleased by the offer. "We would welcome your guidance," he said sincerely. "There is much to learn if we're to implement the practices we've discussed." With this additional agreement established, the settler delegation departed, riding eastward toward Eagle Ridge with the physical tokens of their negotiations, written notes, small gifts exchanged as symbols of goodwill, and most importantly, a transformed understanding of their Lakota neighbors. Margaret watched them go, reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed in the months since she had made the reverse journey, alone and expecting death in the winter snow. Now she stood as an honored elder among the Lakota, a bridge between cultures, her knowledge and experience valued precisely because of its unique perspective rather than dismissed as irrelevant. "Are you certain about returning to Eagle Ridge?" Thomas asked as they walked back toward the center of the encampment. "Even temporarily?" Margaret nodded, having considered the decision carefully. "The agreement we've established is fragile," she explained. "It needs nurturing, especially in these early stages. My presence there can help ensure that the practical knowledge transfers happen as promised, while also reminding them of the human connection between our communities." Thomas accepted this with a thoughtful nod. "You have become an unexpected medicine," he observed, "healing old wounds between peoples as well as bodies." The metaphor resonated with Margaret's own understanding of her evolving role. Like many medicinal plants, she had been uprooted and discarded, only to find new purpose in unexpected soil. The very experience that had nearly destroyed her, rejection by her community, had ultimately positioned her to help transform relations between the peoples who shared this land. The waiting period passed quickly, filled with preparations for the growing season and continued integration of the practices that had helped both communities survive the winter. Dr. Thompson worked steadily with Whichapi, documenting traditional remedies while sharing his own medical knowledge. Their collaboration had produced several innovations, combinations of approaches that proved more effective than either tradition alone for certain conditions. Margaret divided her time between assisting their work, participating in council, meetings, and preparing for her anticipated return to Eagle Ridge. She gathered seeds from plants the settlers typically overlooked, documented food preservation techniques that had proven particularly valuable during the winter scarcity, and worked with Daniel to develop simple explanations of Lakota concepts that might help settlers understand the philosophy behind sustainable practices. Word came on the 23rd day, a rider from Eagle Ridge approaching the Lakota camp with news that the full council had reviewed and accepted the framework agreement with only minor adjustments. Representatives would arrive in 3 days' time for the formal exchange of commitments and to escort Margaret back to the settlement for her temporary teaching role. The news was received with cautious optimism among the Lakota. Even Robert Blackwood, who had maintained his skepticism throughout, acknowledged that the Settler Council's acceptance of the agreement represented significant progress. "They have taken the first step on a long path," he conceded during a council discussion, "though whether they will continue walking, it remains to be seen." "All journeys begin with single steps," Thomas reminded him, "and paths become clearer with use." When the Eagle Ridge delegation arrived, it was larger than before, 8 representatives instead of 5, including Sarah Moon as the first woman officially sent by the Settlement Council. Their expanded presence signified the increased importance Eagle Ridge placed on the formalization of the agreement, a public commitment to the new relationship being established. The ceremony that followed combined elements from both traditions, written, documents signed and exchanged alongside sacred pipe rituals that sealed commitments in the Lakota way. The specific terms had been refined but remained true to the framework established during the initial negotiations. Designated hunting territories with agreed-upon practices, protection zones around shared water sources, regular knowledge exchanges, and biannual councils to address emerging issues and adapt specific arrangements as needed. Most significantly, both communities acknowledge the other's right to exist and prosper on the land they shared, a fundamental shift from the underlying assumption of displacement that had characterized much of settler-native relations throughout the region. It wasn't a comprehensive solution to all potential conflicts, but it established a foundation for cooperation rather than competition, for dialogue rather than confrontation. Following the formal ceremony, preparations were made for Margaret's temporary return to Eagle Ridge. Daniel would accompany her, both as escort and as a continuing symbol of the partnership being established. Dr. Thompson elected to remain with the Lakota, his work with Whichapi still ongoing and yielding valuable insights that he was reluctant to interrupt. On the morning of their departure, Thomas presented Margaret with a gift, a small deerskin pouch containing sacred medicines and a single eagle feather, symbols of her status as an elder respected by the Lakota people. "Carry this with you," he instructed, "not just as protection, but as reminder of who you have become among us." Margaret accepted the gift with deep appreciation, recognizing the spiritual significance it held. "I will honor what it represents," she promised, "and return when my work in Eagle Ridge is complete." The journey eastward felt markedly different from her previous returns to the settlement. She rode not as an outcast or even as a temporary savior, but as an emissary of a new relationship, a living bridge between cultures that had found unexpected common ground. Daniel rode beside her, his presence a tangible reminder of the partnership being forged between communities that had once viewed each other primarily as threats. Eagle Ridge came into view on the second day of travel, its buildings now familiar, yet somehow diminished in significance. What had once been the entire horizon of Margaret's world was now just one point in a larger landscape of meaning and connection. She would return to the Lakota when her work here was complete, carrying with her whatever new understanding emerged from this chapter of her journey. As they approached the settlement, Margaret touched the small medicine pouch Thomas had given, her drawing strength from its symbolic connection to the community that had given her new purpose when another had cast her aside. Whatever challenges awaited in Eagle Ridge, she faced them not as a supplicant seeking readmission, but as an elder whose wisdom transcended the boundaries between worlds. The transformation was complete, from discarded widow to honored elder, from burden to bridge. In her final years, Margaret Winters had found not just survival, but significance, helping to heal divisions between peoples whose shared future on this land depended on learning what she had discovered, that different ways of knowing need not threaten, but could instead enrich each other, creating something stronger and more resilient than either tradition alone could provide. Summer unfolded across the plains, painting the landscape in vibrant greens and golds after the monochrome palette of winter. Margaret's temporary return to Eagle Ridge had extended longer than initially planned, 3 months rather than the few weeks originally envisioned. There had been too much knowledge to share, too many practical skills to demonstrate, too many bridges still being built between the communities. She had established regular workshops for the settlement women, teaching them techniques for preserving foods and identifying useful plants that previous generations of settlers had overlooked. The children had been particularly receptive, gathering around her in the evenings as she shared Lakota stories alongside settler tales, weaving a tapestry of understanding that transcended the divisions of their elders. Daniel had become an unexpected favorite among the younger settlers, his patient demonstrations of Lakota crafts and hunting techniques drawing crowds of curious observers. Some of the older boys had even begun learning rudimentary Lakota phrases, a development that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Not everyone embraced these changes, of course. James Blackwood and his circle maintained their distance, their resentment occasionally spilling over into muttered comments or pointed absences from community gatherings where Margaret and Daniel participated. But they represented a dwindling minority as the practical benefits of cooperation became increasingly evident. The summer crops flourished, enhanced by integrated methods that combined settler farming techniques with Lakota understanding of local growing conditions. Hunting parties from both communities occasionally ventured out together, each learning from the other's approach to tracking and harvesting game with minimal waste. The medicine exchange continued, with regular visits between Dr. Thompson at the Lakota camp and the Eagle Ridge healers. It was during the wheat harvest, as August heat shimmered across the ripening fields, that Margaret realized it was time to return to Pine Creek. Her work in Eagle Ridge had taken root, not just the practical skills she had shared, but the deeper understanding that different ways of knowing could strengthen rather than threaten each community's core identity. She announced her intention at the monthly town council, which now included regular updates on the Lakota agreement and collaborative projects. "The foundations have been laid," she explained, looking around at faces that now regarded her with respect rather than pity or dismissal. "The rest must grow through your own efforts and commitment." Sarah Moon spoke up from her position at the council table, a position that would have been unthinkable for a woman before the crises of the past year had disrupted old hierarchies. "You'll be missed, Margaret. Your guidance has been invaluable." "I'm not disappearing," Margaret replied with a smile, "just returning to my primary home. I'll attend the autumn council between our communities and visit when needed or desired." The wording was deliberate. Primary. Home, rather than simply home, acknowledging her continuing connection to Eagle Ridge while making clear where her deeper allegiance now lay. It was a bridging statement, just as she herself had become a bridge between worlds. Robert Blackwood, who had gradually shifted from antagonist to reluctant ally during her extended stay, nodded acknowledgement of her decision. "You've earned the right to choose your own path," he said, the simple statement representing a profound evolution in his thinking. "And we've learned the folly of presuming to decide another's worth." The recognition of her agency, her right to determine her own life rather than having it dictated by others' assessment of her utility, struck Margaret as perhaps the most significant transformation in the settlement's attitude. It wasn't just about her specifically, but about a fundamental shift in how the community viewed its members, particularly those who didn't fit conventional definitions of productivity. Preparations for her departure were marked by small ceremonies of appreciation, gifts presented by families she had helped, a special meal organized by the women who had studied with her most closely, a handcrafted rocking chair from Peterson, the butcher, who had become an unexpected ally in teaching efficient use of animal resources. On her final evening in Eagle Ridge, Margaret sat on the porch of what had once been her home, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of amber and gold. Sarah Moon joined her, bringing 2 cups of tea and settling into the chair beside her. "I remember when Joseph died," Sarah said quietly, referring to Margaret's husband. "How the settlement rallied around you, how no one questioned that you belonged here, that your knowledge and presence were valuable beyond measure." Margaret nodded, the memory both painful and precious. "Communities forget their better natures sometimes," she observed, "especially when fear takes hold." "We were wrong," Sarah said simply, "not just in how we treated you, but in how we viewed the Lakota, how we approached the land itself. Your journey has changed us all." "Change was already coming," Margaret replied. "I was merely the catalyst, the unexpected connection between worlds that needed to find each other." They sat in companionable silence as darkness gathered, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. Tomorrow, Margaret would ride westward with Daniel, returning to the Lakota camp that had become her true home. But she would carry Eagle Ridge with her, not as a place of rejection and loss, but as part of the larger tapestry of connection being woven between communities that had once viewed each other only through the lens of threat and competition. Dawn broke clear and bright, the late summer air carrying the first hint of autumn's approach. Margaret mounted her horse with practiced ease despite her advancing years, the skills of frontier life ingrained too deeply to be diminished by age. Alone, Daniel rode beside her, his presence a comfortable constant in her journey between worlds. A small gathering had assembled to see them off, not the formal council delegation that might have marked an official departure, but a more organic collection of those who had formed personal connections during her extended stay. Sarah Moon was there, of course, along with several women who had studied with Margaret most intensively. Peterson stood with his wife, their expressions conveying genuine regret at her departure. Even some of the settlement's children had risen, early to wave farewell to the woman whose stories had opened new worlds of understanding. Notably absent was James Blackwood and his circle, their continued resistance a reminder that transformation was never complete or universal. But Margaret found she could view their absence with equanimity rather than resentment. Some seeds fell on rocky ground, as the settler scriptures taught, that didn't diminish the value of those that found fertile soil and flourished. The journey westward took on the quality of a homecoming pilgrimage, each familiar landmark bringing Margaret closer to the community that had saved not just her life, but her sense of purpose and belonging. As they crested the final rise overlooking Pine Creek encampment on the afternoon of the second day, she felt her heart lighten at the sight of smoke rising from cooking fires, the movement of people going about their daily tasks, the simple evidence of life continuing in its seasonal rhythms. Thomas was waiting at the edge of the camp, as he had been at each significant juncture of her journey. His presence, steady and unwavering, symbolized the continuity she had found among the Lakota despite the dramatic changes in her circumstances. "You returned to us whole," he observed as they dismounted, echoing his words from previous homecomings. "Whole and ready for whatever comes next," Margaret confirmed, the phrase emerging as a kind of ritual exchange between them, marking transitions in her evolving role among his people. As they walked toward the center of the encampment, Margaret noticed changes that had occurred during her absence. New lodges erected for families that had joined the band, a larger central gathering space, gardens flourishing with integrated techniques that combined traditional Lakota cultivation with adaptations she and Dr. Thompson had introduced. The doctor himself approached as they neared the central area, his appearance notably altered from the clean-cut young physician who had first arrived from Eagle Ridge. His hair had grown longer, and he wore a mixture of settler and Lakota clothing that reflected his position between cultures. "The prodigal teacher returns," he greeted her with a warm smile. "Your timing is perfect. Wichapi and I have just completed the documentation of winter remedies for the combined medical guide. The project had been ongoing throughout Margaret's time with the Lakota, a comprehensive recording of traditional healing knowledge integrated with scientific understanding, designed to preserve wisdom that might otherwise be lost as younger generations were drawn to settler ways. It represented exactly the kind of balanced exchange that Thomas had envisioned when he first welcomed outsiders into his community. That evening, a feast was held to celebrate Margaret's return. The entire tribe gathered around the central fire, sharing food and stories as twilight deepened into night. Margaret found herself seated in the position of honor beside Thomas, a concrete acknowledgement of her status as a respected elder, despite her settler origins. As the meal concluded, Thomas rose to address the gathering, his voice carrying clearly. In the evening air, "The circle is complete," he announced. "Our sister returns to us, bringing new understanding from her time among the settlers. The bridge between our peoples grows stronger with each crossing." He turned to Margaret, extending his hand in invitation. "Will you speak, grandmother? Will you share what you have learned in your journey?" Margaret rose, conscious of the eyes upon her, not with the suspicious scrutiny she had once faced in Eagle Ridge, but with genuine interest and respect. She spoke of the changes she had witnessed in the settlement, the gradual opening to Lakota knowledge and perspective, the practical applications of shared wisdom that had enhanced both communities' resilience. "The path is not straight or easy," she concluded. "There are still those on both sides who prefer the comfort of old divisions to the challenge of new connections." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.